He had saved the company $11 million in a single quarter, and not one person knew his name. The night everything changed, Mason Reed stood at the edge of a rooftop surrounded by people who looked through him like glass. He was 32 years old, raising 3 children alone, running on 4 hours of sleep and cold coffee. Then she walked in. The most powerful woman in the room crossed it entirely, ignored every executive reaching for her hand, and stopped right in front of him. The man nobody noticed suddenly had every eye in the building on him. Hit the like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this one goes deep. The alarm didn't wake Mason Reed. He'd been lying there for 20 minutes already, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that he kept meaning to report to the landlord and never did. The apartment was quiet in that particular way it got before the kids woke up. Not peaceful exactly. More like the silence between one hard thing ending and another hard thing starting. He sat up slowly. His back had that low ache it always carried now, the kind that lived between his shoulder blades and never fully left. He was 32 years old. He moved like he was 45. The bedroom was small enough that he could reach his dresser without standing all the way up. He dressed in the dark out of habit. Didn't want to risk waking Lily, whose room shared a wall so thin he could sometimes hear her breathing. She was 9. She still slept with a stuffed rabbit named Gerald that was missing one eye and half its stuffing. He'd offered to buy her a new one twice. Both times she'd looked at him like he'd suggested replacing a family member. He moved to the kitchen. The linoleum floor had a cold spot near the refrigerator that hit different every morning. Bills were stacked on the left side of the counter, held down by a coffee mug with a crack in the handle. He didn't look at them. He'd looked at them last night, run the numbers 3 times, and the math hadn't improved any of the 3 times he checked. Looking again at 5:47 in the morning wasn't going to change anything. He started the coffee. While it ran, he checked on the other 2. Caleb, 14, was asleep on his stomach with one arm hanging off the bed like he'd fallen there from a height. His backpack sat half open near the door, one textbook threatening to slide out. Mason picked it up quietly and zipped the bag shut. The kid had a history test today. They'd gone over the Civil War for 45 minutes last night at the kitchen table, Mason reading from the textbook, while Caleb made increasingly elaborate arguments for why dates shouldn't count if you understood the broader context. Mason had told him the teacher probably didn't share that philosophy. Caleb had said the teacher didn't share a lot of things. He was not wrong about that. The third room, which was really a converted alcove with a curtain instead of a door, belonged to 7-year-old Sophie. She was curled so tightly in her blanket that only a tuft of dark hair was visible. She'd had a nightmare 2 nights ago and climbed into Mason's bed at 3 in the morning, cold feet and everything, and had announced very seriously that she dreamed there was a monster under the house. Mason had told her that monsters were afraid of their building's landlord, Mr. Portillo, and that even monsters knew better than to mess with a man who charged that much for parking. Sophie had considered this deeply and decided it made sense. He stood in her doorway for a second longer than he needed to. Then he went back to the kitchen, drank half his coffee standing over the sink, grabbed his bag, and left. The offices of Black Ridge Capital occupied floors 19 through 24 of a glass tower in downtown Miami that had won some architectural award in 2019. Mason had seen the plaque in the lobby every morning for 3 years and never once read what the award was actually for. He arrived at 6:15. The security guard, a heavy-set man named Terrell, who worked the overnight shift and was perpetually 3 days into growing a beard, buzzed him through without looking up. Reed. Terrell. You're early again. Always. Man. Terrell shook his head with the particular exhaustion of someone who found punctuality personally offensive. You need a hobby. Mason took the elevator to the 21st floor, which was where the risk analysis division lived. At 6:15 in the morning, it was completely empty. No one else from his department came in before 8:30. A few of the senior analysts rolled in around 9. His direct manager, a man named Dennis Holt, had never once arrived before 9:45 in the 3 years Mason had worked under him. Mason didn't mind this quiet. He preferred it, actually. The floor was different before people arrived. The hum of the HVAC system, the pale gray light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the faint smell of the cleaning crew's work. He could think clearly here. The noise of the day hadn't started yet. He set down his bag, pulled up his 3 monitors, and started in on the Albrecht portfolio review he'd been working on since Tuesday. The Albrecht account was a mid-sized institutional investor that Blackridge had been managing for 6 years. Mason had noticed a pattern in the derivatives exposure that didn't sit right with him. A concentration of risk in a sector that, based on what he was reading in the macro indicators, was about to get very uncomfortable very fast. He'd flagged it twice in internal memos. Both times, the response had been some version of the senior team is aware and monitoring the situation. Mason suspected the senior team was aware, the way someone is aware. There's a weird noise in their car engine. They knew it was there. They decided not to deal with it, and they were hoping it would resolve itself before they had to. It wouldn't. He pulled up the data and started building a new analysis. Not because anyone had asked him to, not because he'd get credit for it, but because $11 million of someone's retirement fund was sitting in a position that was going to get hit, and Mason was the kind of person who couldn't unknow a thing once he knew it. He worked until 7:30, when the first of his colleagues started filtering in. His coworker Brandon Cole arrived at 8:15, which was early for him, wearing a suit that cost more than Mason's monthly rent, and carrying a coffee from the place on the ground floor that charged $9 for something with oat milk and a name that sounded like a real estate development. Brandon was 29, the son of one of Blackridge's founding partners, and had the particular confidence of someone who had never once in his life been told that a door wasn't open to him. He wasn't stupid exactly. He was smart in the way a car alarm is loud, effectively, insistently, in a way that made you wish it would stop. He dropped his bag on his desk, which was twice the size of Mason's, despite Brandon's actual output being roughly a quarter of Mason's, and leaned against the cubicle divider. "Reed, you hear about tonight?" Mason didn't look up from his screen. "The gala. The rooftop gala. Top floor of the building, 9 o'clock, catering from Delacroix, open bar, the works." Brandon leaned closer, dropping his voice to the register people use when they want to sound important. "Evelyn Hart is supposed to make an appearance." Now Mason looked up, but only because the name was relevant to something he'd been thinking about for weeks. Evelyn Hart, CEO of Hartwell Global. The firm had been quietly making moves in several sectors that overlapped directly with Blackridge's client base. If she was here, it meant something. "Who confirmed that?" he asked. "My dad heard it from Wickham." Wickham was Richard Wickham, Blackridge's CEO, a 61-year-old man who had the energy of someone constantly preparing for a golf game. She reached out, apparently, interested in some kind of partnership exploration. Mason turned this over. "What kind of partnership?" Brandon shrugged. "The kind where everybody gets richer. Come on, Reed, it's a party. You should come. Network a little. You know what networking is, right?" Mason looked back at his screen. "I'll think about it." "You always say that?" "I always think about it." Brandon made a sound that was not quite a laugh and walked back to his desk. Mason did think about it. For about 4 seconds. Then he went back to the Albrecht analysis, because whether or not he attended a rooftop gala had zero effect on whether a derivatives position blew up in a client's face. He finished the analysis at 11:20 a.m. and sent it to Dennis Holt with a note that was careful and specific about what he'd found and what he recommended. He copied 2 senior analysts, Garrett Walsh and Priya Nair, who technically had oversight on the account. By noon, he hadn't heard anything back. He ate lunch at his desk, a sandwich he'd made at home. Turkey, mustard, one of those small bags of chips that Caleb always tried to claim before Mason could get to them. He ate while reading a report on commercial real estate exposure in the Southeast Corridor, which was not relaxing lunch content by most people's standards, but which Mason found genuinely interesting in a way he'd stopped trying to explain to other people. At 1:15, Priya stopped by his desk. She was in her mid-30s, one of the smarter people on the floor, and she had the look of someone who wanted to say something and had been working up to it. "Your Albrecht memo," she said. Dennis forwarded it to Wickham's office. Mason waited. With Dennis's name on it. Mason looked at her. Priya looked back. The silence between them held about 3 different conversations at once. "Did it go through?" Mason asked. "They're reviewing the position. Wickham's team is recommending an adjustment." She paused. "So, yes, it went through." "Good." She seemed like she wanted to say something else. "Mason, it went through," he said again. That's what matters. She stood there a moment longer, then walked back to her desk. Mason turned back to his screen. His chest had that tight feeling it sometimes got when he caught himself caring about something he shouldn't care about. The credit, the acknowledgement, the basic adult recognition that he'd done a thing and done it well. He knew how to push it back down. He'd had a lot of practice. The gala started at 9. Mason almost didn't go. He'd gotten home at 6:30, made pasta with the jar of marinara that was on its last legs, helped Sophie with a worksheet about community helpers, spent 20 minutes going back over Caleb's history notes, and put Lily to bed at 8:15 while she informed him, very calmly, that her friend Zoe had a dog now and that she believed strongly that they should also get a dog. Mason had asked what kind. Lily had said the kind that was soft and didn't bark too much and ideally could sleep in her bed. Mason had said he would think about it. He'd meant it genuinely in the way he meant a lot of things that lived in a holding pattern between wanting to give his kids what they wanted and the numbers on the counter to the left of the coffee mug. His neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, was 63 and had a tendency to appear at their door with food she claimed was leftovers, but which was clearly not leftovers. It was food she'd made intentionally for them. She'd offered to sit with the kids before Mason had even finished asking. She'd waved away his thanks with the particular efficiency of a woman who had no patience for gratitude. He took the elevator up at 8:50 in a suit that was 3 years old but clean and pressed, and he felt, climbing toward the top of his own building, approximately as out of place as it was possible to feel without actually leaving the premises. The rooftop had been transformed. That was the only word for it. What was normally a functional building terrace with HVAC units and concrete had been covered with low furniture, ambient lighting, bartending stations, and the kind of floral arrangements that probably cost more per bouquet than Mason spent on groceries for a week. The Miami skyline spread out in every direction, the water catching the city lights, the kind of view that makes people forget, briefly, that the world has edges. It was full of people Mason recognized by reputation more than by any real relationship. Executives, senior partners, the firm's top clients. The women were in dresses that caught light. The men were in suits that fit differently than his did. Not in any way he could have articulated, just in the way things fit when the price point is a different universe entirely. He got a drink from the bar, something with ice that he didn't drink very much of. He stood near the edge of the terrace and watched the skyline and thought about the Albrecht derivatives exposure and whether there was a secondary position in the same client's portfolio that had similar characteristics. And he was in the middle of that thought when Brandon Cole materialized at his elbow. "Reed, you actually came. You seem surprised." "I'm surprised." Brandon looked him over in the way people do when they're assessing how someone else stacks up against the room. "You come alone?" "I live alone." "I know you live alone. I mean, you couldn't find anyone?" Mason took a sip of his drink. "I didn't look." Brandon made a face that was somewhere between pity and amusement, which was the face he defaulted to around Mason with some regularity. "Man, you're single. You're, what, 32? You should be—" "Brandon." "Yeah? How's your analysis of the Meridian Fund going?" A pause. "I'm still working on it. It was assigned 3 weeks ago." Another pause. Shorter, sharper. "I'm still working on it." Mason nodded and looked back at the skyline. Brandon, who was not without self-awareness but who had learned to work around it efficiently, shifted topics. "The Hart woman isn't here yet. Wickham's been checking his phone every 4 minutes." He glanced toward the center of the terrace where Richard Wickham stood in a cluster of senior partners, doing exactly that. They want this partnership bad. Apparently Hartwell's been making moves in the emerging market space that overlap heavily with 3 of our biggest clients. "I know. You know, I wrote a brief on it in March. It was in the quarterly risk summary." Brandon looked at him the way people look at someone who has just said something both true and inconvenient. "Right," he said. "Well, if she shows up and you get a chance to make an impression—" "I'm not here to make an impression." "Then why are you here?" Mason looked at the city, at the water in the distance, dark and glinting, at the space between the lights where the bay went quiet and deep and didn't particularly care about the gala or the partnership or any of it. "Honestly," he said, "I don't know." Brandon drifted away soon after, pulled toward a cluster of clients closer to the center of the action. Mason stayed where he was. He finished his drink. He set the empty glass down on a passing server's tray and decided he'd given this thing enough of his evening. His back hurt. He had a 6:15 alarm. Mrs. Delgado was watching his kids, and while she'd told him to stay as long as he wanted, there was a version of what he wanted that involved being back in his own apartment with the door shut. He turned toward the elevator bank. He was 15 feet away from it when the room changed. He didn't see it happen so much as feel it, that particular shift in collective attention when a room full of people all orient toward the same thing at once. The volume dropped. Not gone, just suddenly lower, the way music sounds when someone turns a dial. He turned around. She came out of the private elevator on the far side of the terrace, the one reserved for ownership and high-profile visitors. And the first thing Mason noticed was that she wasn't performing her arrival. That was the thing. Every other significant entrance he'd seen at events like this, the ones he'd observed from the perimeter, the ones he'd never been part of, had some quality of theater to them, some awareness of being watched. She just walked in. Evelyn Hart was 30 years old. He knew that from the financial press. She'd been the subject of several profiles in the past 2 years, the kind of articles that led with her age in the headline, because apparently the combination of her age and her title still qualified as newsworthy. She was wearing something dark and simple, no jewelry that he could see, and she moved across the terrace with the kind of ease that comes not from arrogance, but from being completely clear about where you're going. Richard Wickham was moving toward her. So were 3 other senior partners. So was Brandon Cole, who had the particular acceleration of someone who'd decided in real time that this was the introduction that was going to define the next 5 years of his career. Evelyn Hart looked at none of them. She was looking at Mason. He froze, which was not something he did. He was not a person who froze, but her gaze had come across 20 feet of crowded rooftop and landed on him with a specificity that made no sense. Not the casual survey of someone scanning a room, but the recognition of someone who had found what they were looking for. She changed direction. Wickham slowed. Walsh and the senior partners slowed. Brandon, who had been at maybe a 7-foot intercept angle, came to a complete stop. She stopped in front of Mason. She was roughly his height, close enough that he could see she was slightly out of breath. From the stairs. From whatever had come before this. And there was a quality to her stillness that wasn't anything like the forced composure he'd expect from someone walking into a room full of people who wanted things from her. She just looked at him, steady, almost careful. "You were leaving," she said. It wasn't quite a question. His mouth was dry. He was aware, in some distant part of his brain, that every person on the rooftop was watching this interaction. He was aware that Richard Wickham's expression had gone from anticipatory to confused, to something that was rapidly shading into something else entirely. He was aware that Brandon Cole looked like a man whose entire understanding of the social order had just been recalled for a manufacturing defect. "I was," Mason said. She tilted her head slightly, something in her eyes, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Don't." He stood there. She extended her hand. "Evelyn Hart." He took it. Her grip was firm and brief and entirely unself-conscious. "Mason Reed." "I know," she said. 3 seconds. 4. The silence between them was not awkward. That was the strange part. It should have been awkward. The whole rooftop watching, the absurdity of the situation, the complete absence of any context for how this was happening. But it wasn't. It was just still, like the moment before a storm when the air holds something and you know something's about to shift, but you don't know yet what direction. "I'd like to talk to you," she said, "when you have a moment." "I have a moment," Mason said, because he didn't know what else to say, and because somewhere in him, past the exhaustion and the back pain and the bills on the kitchen counter, something was paying very close attention. She smiled. Not the smile from the profiles, the curated one from the staged interviews. Something smaller than that, and more real. Good. Behind her, Richard Wickham had begun the specific sequence of facial expressions that a powerful man makes when reality stops following the script he'd prepared. Brandon Cole was holding his $9 coffee with both hands and staring. Priya Nair, who had appeared at some point near the edge of the terrace, caught Mason's eye across the crowd with an expression that said, clearly, What is happening right now? Mason didn't know, but for the first time in longer than he could remember. For the first time in a night, he'd almost skipped. In a year of almost skipping everything that wasn't directly related to keeping 3 children fed and sheltered and growing up okay, he didn't feel invisible. He felt, with a certainty he couldn't explain, that something was beginning. He just didn't know what kind of beginning it was. He'd been wrong about beginnings before. He'd been wrong about a lot of things. He was tired enough that he might be wrong about this too. But she was still looking at him. And the room was still watching, and the city below was still doing what cities do. Indifferent, enormous, lit up against the dark water. And Mason Reed, who had arrived early and planned to leave early and expected nothing from this night except another quiet ride down 19 floors and a drive home in the dark, was still standing there, not leaving. They found a corner of the terrace where the lighting was lower, near the railing, with the city spreading south toward Brickell. A server materialized and offered drinks. Evelyn took water. Mason took water too, not because he particularly wanted it, but because his hands needed something to do. "You work at Blackridge," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Risk analysis, 3rd year." She nodded, looking out at the water briefly. "Do you like it?" It was such a straightforward question that it caught him off guard. He thought about it, actually. Not the automatic answer, but the real one. "I like the work," he said. "The analysis, the problem-solving part, the actual thinking about it. But not the rest of it. The rest of it is something else." She turned to look at him. "What does that mean?" He considered. "You do good work and someone else puts their name on it. You flag a problem, and the flag gets forwarded with different attribution. After a while, you wonder if it matters who does the work, or if it just matters who's standing closest to the credit when it lands." She was quiet for a second. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. "And you keep doing the work anyway. It needs to be done." "By you specifically?" "By someone." He turned his glass in his hands. "I happened to be there." She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he noticed it. Not uncomfortable, but deliberate. Like she was checking something. Like she was comparing what was in front of her against something she already knew and was figuring out if they matched. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Emerging markets exposure and diversified institutional portfolios, specifically in the current rate environment. Where do you think the under-recognized risk is?" He blinked. Of all the turns the conversation could have taken. "That's a specific question for a rooftop party." "I don't really do rooftop parties," she said. "I'm doing this one for reasons that I'm starting to think are more interesting than I expected. But if you'd rather talk about something else—" "No," he said. "No, Give me a second." He thought about it. Not the prepared answer, not the language from the memo, but the actual texture of what he'd been chewing on for the past 6 weeks. The piece of it that kept nagging at him in the early mornings when the floor was empty and he was 3 monitors deep in someone else's money. "Currency mismatch," he said. "Everyone's watching the rate spread. Everyone's stress testing for the obvious scenarios. But the actual exposure is in the currency hedging on the EM-denominated positions. The hedges are correlated in ways that aren't modeled correctly because they're using historical correlations from a different volatility regime. When it moves, they're going to find out the hedge was a fraction of what they thought it was." She was very still. "And they're not going to find out slowly," he continued. "It'll be fast. The way these things go, it'll be fine, and then it'll be over. No middle." "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since about February." "Did you write it up?" "Twice. Both times it got absorbed into someone else's quarterly summary with the specific piece I was worried about removed." He paused. "I assume because it was inconvenient." She looked at him. Her water glass was untouched. The party continued behind them. The hum of 100 conversations, Wickham's laughter somewhere near the center, the city doing its thing below. "Mason," she said. His name in her voice, he registered it somewhere that he couldn't quite locate in himself, somewhere past the professional and the logical. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Okay? Do you know who I am?" "CEO of Hartwell Global. Took the reins at 27 after your father stepped back. Built the emerging markets division from—" "No." She shook her head slightly. I don't mean professionally. He stopped. She was watching him carefully, not anxiously. She didn't seem like someone who did anxious, but waiting for something specific. I don't understand the question, he said. She looked at him for another long moment. Then something in her expression shifted, something resolving, a decision being made. Have you ever talked to someone online, she said slowly, who you felt like you actually knew? The air changed. He went completely still. Someone you could say the real thing to, she continued, because they couldn't see you and you couldn't see them. And somehow that made honesty easier. Nova, Mason said. Her mouth closed. Something moved across her face. Not surprise, because she'd been moving toward this, but something like relief, or recognition, or the particular feeling of something that's been suspended finally settling. Nova, she confirmed. He stared at her. 8 months. 8 months of late nights. 3 monitors down. The kids in bed. The apartment quiet. 8 months of conversations that had been the only place in his entire life where he felt like a complete person and not just a function. Not just the dad, the analyst, the man with the bills on the counter. 8 months of talking about risk theory and moral philosophy and what it meant to build something that lasted and whether integrity was a luxury or a necessity and 100 other things he'd never said out loud to anyone in his physical life. And now? That's not possible, he said. His voice came out flat in a way that had nothing to do with emotion. It was the flatness of a system trying to process something that doesn't fit the available categories. I know how it sounds. He stopped, started again. You have 400 employees you manage. 11 billion in assets, yes. She said it like it was information she was tired of carrying. I also couldn't sleep at 3 a.m. for about 2 months last spring, and I was reading an analysis thread on a finance forum that you'd written. You used a different handle, but the writing was... She paused, choosing the word. Specific. You think in a specific way. I asked a question. You answered. A beat. You remember. He remembered. He remembered exactly. April. The thread was about systemic risk in interconnected debt markets, and someone had asked a question that most people in the thread were answering in a way that was technically correct and practically useless, and he'd spent 40 minutes writing out what he actually thought. The full version. The version he never got to say in a conference room. And then someone called Nova had written back, and the conversation had gone for 3 hours that night. I didn't know, he said. It came out almost like an accusation, which wasn't what he meant. I know you didn't know. She stopped. In the pause, he heard something unusual. Something that sounded like someone choosing to be honest about something that cost them something. I recognized you 2 weeks ago. When your name came up in a report my team compiled on Blackridge. There was a brief about EM currency exposures that was attributed to a Dennis Holt, but that I knew, the second I read it, was written by you. Mason said nothing. The language was yours, she said. The framework was yours. I'd have known it anywhere. She looked directly at him. I wanted to come tonight to see if I was right. He looked at her. At this woman who was Nova, who had heard him, actually heard him, in the middle of 8 months of nights when he'd been invisible everywhere else. Who was now standing on a rooftop in Miami telling him she'd known who he was before she walked through the door. Were you? He asked. Yes, she said simply. Behind them, somewhere in the party, Brandon Cole was probably working his way toward them. Wickham was probably watching. The whole machinery of the evening was probably pressing towards something that would make this into a transaction, a networking opportunity, a relationship with a return on investment. Mason looked at Evelyn Hart, at Nova, and felt something crack open in his chest that he'd been keeping shut for a very long time. Not hope exactly. He was too tired for unqualified hope, too schooled in how things actually went, but something real. I have 3 kids, he said, for no particular reason. Or maybe for a very particular reason. Maybe because if this was going to be anything at all, it needed to start with the whole truth. I'm raising them alone. I'm basically running on no sleep, and I have a spreadsheet where I track whether I can afford to replace the hot water heater this month or next month, and the answer right now is next month. He stopped. I'm not what people think when they think about who talks to you. She looked at him, not with pity, not with the particular softness of someone rearranging their view of you downward. Just looked at him. "No," she said, "you're not." She said it like a fact, like a thing that had already been decided. The Miami night held around them, loud and warm and indifferent. The party continued behind them. The city spread south and west toward the water. Mason Reed stood at the edge of the railing with an empty glass and a back that hurt, and a hot water heater timing problem, and 3 kids asleep 11 blocks away. And somehow, inexplicably, he was being seen by someone who already knew him, who had come here specifically to find him. He didn't know what to do with that. He decided, for now, not to do anything with it, just to stand there and let it be real. He left the gala at 10:45. Not early the way he'd planned, early in the sense that Richard Wickham was still working the room when he went, still throwing glances toward the corner where Mason had stood with Evelyn for over an hour, still recalibrating something in his expression that hadn't resolved by the time the elevator doors closed. The ride down was 21 floors. It felt like something longer. He paid Mrs. Delgado back with the cash he kept in the kitchen drawer. She protested, as always, and he pressed it into her hand anyway, as always. She studied his face in the way she sometimes did, with the particular perceptiveness of a woman who had been paying attention to people for 63 years. "You look different," she said. "I'm tired," he said. She looked at him a moment longer. "Not tired different," she said, and let it go. He checked on the kids. Sophie had migrated from her alcove to the couch with her blanket and Gerald, and was snoring in a way that was objectively too loud for someone 7 years old. Caleb's light was off. Lily's door was cracked. He could hear the sound machine she'd had since she was 2. White noise, low and constant. He stood in the hallway between the 3 of them for a second. Then he went to bed. He lay there in the dark, thinking about a conversation on a finance forum in April, and a woman on a rooftop in Miami, and the way something can exist in 2 different places in your head at once. Nova, who had been one kind of real, and Evelyn Hart, who was an entirely different kind, and the fact that they were the same person, and what that meant, and whether it meant anything at all, or whether he was building something in his head that was going to cost him in the morning. The water stain on the ceiling was still there. His back still hurt. The bills were still on the counter. He closed his eyes. He was not the kind of man things happened to. He knew that. 3 years at Blackridge had confirmed it with some regularity. He was the kind of man who made things happen, quietly, with no attribution, while other people took the credit and moved toward the light. But tonight, someone had come across a room specifically to find him. Tonight, he had not been invisible. He didn't know yet what that was worth. He didn't know yet what came next. He was too honest with himself to decide in the dark, alone, that this was the beginning of something good. Beginnings could go wrong. He knew that in ways he didn't like to think about directly. But he was 32 years old and tired in the bones, and 3 kids deep in a life that didn't leave much room for anything unexpected. And something unexpected had happened. He let that be enough. For tonight, just that. He fell asleep before midnight, which was early for him. He slept without dreaming, which was rare. The alarm would come at 5:47, the coffee would be there, the bills would be there. The world would be exactly what it was. But tonight, at the edge of a rooftop he'd been about to leave, a woman named Nova had looked across a crowd of people who wanted something from her and had walked past all of them. She'd walked to him. He didn't know yet what to do with that, but he knew he'd been carrying it home with him carefully, like something breakable, like something he didn't want to put down in the dark until he could see it better in the light. The city hummed outside his window. Mason Reed closed his eyes, and for one night, just one, he let himself stop fighting against the possibility that he was worth finding. The next morning arrived the way mornings do when something has shifted in the night. The alarm sounded the same. The ceiling stain was still there. The coffee maker dripped at the same pace it always did. But Mason moved through the routine with the feeling that the floor under him was slightly different. Not unstable, just different. The way a room feels when someone has rearranged the furniture by 2 inches. Everything technically in the right place, but your body knowing something has moved. He got the kids up, made eggs because there was still half a carton left, packed Caleb's lunch while Caleb argued that the sandwich ratio of bread to filling was philosophically imbalanced. Mason told him to eat it anyway. Sophie spilled orange juice on the sleeve of her school shirt and dealt with this crisis with the same gravity she brought to all crises, which was full and total. Lily was quiet in the way she got sometimes in the mornings, eating slowly, looking out the window at the parking lot below with an expression Mason recognized as thinking hard about something. "You okay?" he asked her. She looked at him. "Do you think Gerald could use a new friend?" "What kind of friend?" "A smaller rabbit, to keep him company when I'm at school." "Stuffed or real?" She considered this seriously. "Stuffed. For now." He told her they'd look into it. She went back to her orange juice. He finished packing Caleb's lunch, redistributed the sandwich filling to more acceptable ratios to end the philosophical dispute, and got all three of them out the door 7 minutes late, which was actually 4 minutes better than Tuesday. He dropped them at the school 3 blocks over and drove to work with the radio off, which was unusual for him. He was thinking about the night before, not in the way of someone replaying a highlight, more like turning an object over in your hands, looking at it from different angles, trying to understand its actual shape. He had talked to Nova for 8 months. He had told Nova things he hadn't told anyone, not because he was secretive by nature, but because there was no one in his immediate life to tell. His sister lived in Atlanta, and they talked every few weeks, surface level, careful around certain topics. His friends from before, the ones from college, and the years when his life had a different shape, had drifted to a distance that wasn't anyone's fault, but was just the math of time and divergence, and him being a person who went home to 3 kids every night while they did other things. Mrs. Delgado was wonderful, and he would do anything for her, and she understood his situation in ways many people didn't. But she was 63 and his neighbor, and not exactly someone he was going to tell about the way he actually felt at work, or about the particular hollowness of being competent in a room that refused to notice. Nova had noticed. Nova had asked him questions that required real answers. Not "how was your day," but "do you think intellectual honesty is compatible with institutional loyalty? Or does one always eventually cost you the other?" They'd fought about that one, actually. Not viciously, but genuinely. The kind of argument where both people have a real position and neither is performing it. Mason had argued that you could maintain both if you were deliberate about where you placed your loyalty. To the work, not the institution. Nova had pushed back, said that was a comfortable distinction that broke down under real pressure. Said institutions were built to convert individual integrity into collective compliance, and calling that personal rather than institutional loyalty was a story people told themselves. He'd spent 3 days thinking about that argument. He'd come back and said she had a point, but that the alternative, abandoning institutional participation entirely, was only available to people with enough resources to absorb the consequences, and most people weren't those people. She'd gone quiet for a moment and then said, "That's the truest thing you've said." He'd not known what to do with that. He still didn't, entirely. He parked in the Black Ridge garage and sat in the car for 30 seconds. Then he went inside. Terrell buzzed him through without looking up, said his name. Mason said his. That was the whole exchange. He took the elevator to 21. The floor was empty. He sat down, opened his monitors, and stared at his email for a full minute before actually reading any of it. There was nothing from Evelyn Hart. He hadn't expected there to be. They hadn't exchanged contact information, or not new contact information, and the professional channel would have been strange. But he noticed the absence the way you notice the absence of a sound you'd gotten used to. He started working. An hour passed, then 2. The floor filled up around him in the normal sequence, the early arrivals, then the middle wave, then Brandon Cole at 8:15 with a different expensive coffee, a different expensive suit, and the expression of someone who had been up late processing information. Brandon didn't say anything when he came in. He sat down at his desk and did something on his computer and didn't come over. That lasted 20 minutes, which was almost a personal record for Brandon. Then, read. Mason didn't look up. Cole, last night. You and Evelyn Hart. A pause. What was that? A conversation. For an hour. Approximately. Another pause, longer. Mason could feel Brandon working through something. You know her? I met her last night. You met her last night and spent an hour talking to her, and Wickham spent the rest of the evening trying to figure out what you were talking about. Brandon's voice had a quality Mason recognized, Not quite jealousy, not quite accusation, but somewhere in that territory, looking for higher ground. What did you talk to her about? Mason finally looked up. Brandon was leaning against the cubicle divider in the way he did when he was trying to look casual and failing. Finance, Mason said. Finance. And ethics. Brandon stared at him. You talked to Evelyn Hart about ethics. She brought it up. Why would she? He stopped, recalibrated. Wickham wants to see you. Mason looked at him. When? This morning. He had his assistant send you a calendar invite. Brandon's expression was doing several things at once, none of them simple. Like 10 minutes ago. Mason checked his calendar. There it was. 9:30 a.m., Wickham's office, no listed agenda. He looked at the clock. It was 9:18. Thanks, he said. Read. Brandon's voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, more direct. The version of Brandon that appeared occasionally when the performance dropped for a second. What's actually going on? I don't know yet, Mason said honestly. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the elevator. Richard Wickham's office occupied the corner of the 24th floor with a view that cost the firm approximately 4,000 square feet of premium Miami real estate to maintain. It was the kind of office that had been designed to communicate a message before anyone spoke a word. The scale of the furniture, the placement of the desk, the way your chair was slightly lower than his. Wickham was 61, silver-haired, and had the energy of someone who had been successful for long enough that he'd started to mistake his personality for wisdom. He wasn't malicious. Mason had worked in proximity to him for 3 years and had concluded that Wickham was genuinely smart in a narrow way and genuinely oblivious in a broad one. He valued people who were visible in the ways he understood visibility: presentation, connections, the ability to fill a room. The work that happened below that level, the kind Mason did, was theoretically important to him the way the foundation of a building is important. He needed it to exist, but he didn't particularly want to think about it. His assistant, a composed woman in her 40s named Renata, showed Mason in and offered coffee. He declined. He sat down in the chair across from Wickham's desk, which was, as predicted, slightly lower than Wickham's. Wickham studied him for a moment, not long, but long enough to be deliberate. The study of a man recalibrating something. Mason. He said the name like he was confirming it was the right one. Mr. Wickham. You had quite a conversation with Evelyn Hart last night. We talked for a while, yes. About? Mason considered the question. Wickham's face was neutral, professionally so, but there was something operational happening behind the neutrality. Analysis, mostly. She had questions about our approach to EM exposure. She asked about our internal approach. She asked general questions. I answered in general terms. Wickham nodded, slow and deliberate. She made an impression on you? An interesting way to frame it. She's clearly sharp, Mason said. Sharp. Wickham leaned back in his chair. That's one way to put it. Evelyn Hart manages more AUM at 30 than most people in this industry manage at 60. She's been on the cover of 3 financial magazines in the last 2 years, and she chose to spend an hour at my firm's event talking to... He stopped himself. Something behind his eyes adjusted. She clearly found your conversation valuable. Mason waited. He could feel the shape of where this was going before it arrived. I want to be straightforward with you, Wickham said, which was what people said immediately before they weren't. There's an opportunity here. Hartwell Global and Blackridge have overlapping client interests in several sectors. A formal partnership, data sharing, co-investment structures, potentially joint advisory services, could be enormously valuable to both firms. He paused. And to the people who helped make it happen. Mason said nothing. You clearly made an impression on her. That's a resource, Mason. A real one. If you could help facilitate a closer relationship, introductions, a continued dialogue, building on whatever connection you two established last night. I'm not going to do that, Mason said. Wickham blinked. Excuse me? Use my relationship with her as a business development tool. He said it evenly, not aggressively, just as a statement of fact. Whatever we talked about last night, it wasn't a pitch. I'm not going to go back to her with an agenda she didn't sign up for. The office was very quiet for a moment. The air conditioning moved through it. Mason. Wickham's voice had taken on a different quality. Still measured, but the patience in it thinner now, something harder showing through. I'm offering you an opportunity, a promotion, a significant salary increase. We can talk specifics. In exchange for facilitating what could be the most significant partnership this firm has established in a decade. This is how business development works. I understand how it works. Then you understand what I'm offering you. I do. He met Wickham's eyes. And I'm telling you that I won't do it that way. Another silence, longer. Wickham studied him with an expression Mason had seen on people before. The expression of someone who has encountered a variable they didn't account for and is running calculations about what it means. Think about it, Wickham said finally. The tone made it less of a suggestion than it sounded. Mason thought about it for the time it took him to stand up. I've thought about it, he said. Thank you for the meeting. He walked out. Renata didn't make eye contact as he passed her desk. He took the elevator back to 21 and sat down at his desk, and his hands were completely steady, which surprised him a little. Brandon was watching him from across the floor with badly concealed attention. Two other analysts had turned slightly in their chairs. Mason opened his work files and went back to the currency analysis he'd been running for the past 3 weeks, which still needed to be done regardless of everything else, and did not allow himself to think too hard about what had just happened in that corner office with the 4,000 square foot view. Not yet. He'd think about it tonight. He worked until 6:15, which was 15 minutes longer than usual, and drove home in the kind of deliberate focus that meant he was saving something for when he had the space to actually feel it. He made dinner, pasta again, different sauce, the kids didn't notice, helped with homework, dealt with a conflict between Caleb and Lily about something involving the shared bathroom that had escalated to a full tribunal situation by the time Mason got involved and had to be adjudicated with the patience of someone who had settled considerably higher stakes disputes by day. Sophie fell asleep at the kitchen table with her face next to her math worksheet and had to be carried to her alcove. He put everyone to bed. He cleaned up the kitchen. He looked at the bills on the counter. The hot water heater fund was still running short, and moved them slightly to the right, which achieved nothing functionally but made the counter feel less oppressive. He sat down at his desk in the corner of his bedroom, which was also the corner of the room where his 3 monitors lived, and which at 9:30 at night was the only place in the apartment that was entirely his. He opened his laptop. There was a message from Nova. He stared at it. It had come in 2 hours ago, to the account she'd had for 8 months. The account she'd always used, the anonymous one, the one that had only ever been theirs. He had not expected this. He had not figured out yet how to metabolize the information that Nova was Evelyn Hart, and now here was a message from Nova, and the two things were still sitting in different parts of his brain trying to figure out how to coexist. He read it. I should have told you sooner. I had reasons that made sense to me and that I suspect will sound less convincing when I try to explain them out loud. I'm not asking you to be fine with it. I just want you to know that nothing I said in 8 months was different than it would have been if you'd known from the start. It was all real. Every argument, everything I actually believed, every time you made me rethink something, real. He read it twice, then a third time. He typed, "Why didn't you?" Her response came in 4 minutes, which meant she was at her computer. Because you talked to me differently when you didn't know. Everyone talks to me differently when they know. I wanted to know what you were actually like. He sat with that. That's not entirely fair. No, it's not. I know that. You had information about me that I didn't have about you. Yes. For 8 months. Yes. A pause, then, I'm not defending it. I'm explaining it. There's a difference. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. The water stain was not visible from this angle, but he knew it was there. He thought about 8 months of conversation, about the argument over institutional loyalty, about a night in June when he'd been particularly stretched thin. Lily had been sick, a work deadline had compounded against it, and he'd been up at 2 in the morning when he was supposed to be sleeping and had ended up on the forum instead, and Nova had been there, and he'd said something that night that he'd never said out loud. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this at the level I'm doing it. I don't mean the job, I mean all of it. I'm running at 100% of my capacity, and there's nothing left over. And Nova had said, That's not sustainable, but it's also not permanent. Things change. They don't always change the way you want, but they change. He'd asked, "How do you know that?" And she'd said, "Because nothing that takes that much effort to maintain stays exactly the same. Something gives eventually. I'd rather it give on your terms." He'd thought about that for weeks afterward. Now he typed, "You said you recognized me from a report in March. How long between recognizing me and coming to the gala?" "About 6 weeks." "You spent 6 weeks knowing who I was." "Yes. Did you consider telling me?" A longer pause this time. "I considered it about 40 times. Every time I started to figure out how to do it, I got stuck on. I didn't want it to change things. I knew it would change things. I didn't know if what was between us would survive becoming something real, and I didn't want to lose it." He read that sentence several times. "It already was real," he typed. "I know. That's what made it complicated." He pressed his hands flat on the desk. The apartment was quiet. The white noise from Lily's room, the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the city outside doing its thing. His life in all its parts, held in this one small space. "Can I ask you something?" he typed. "Always. What did you expect to happen?" "At the gala, when you walked up to me." Another long pause. He watched the cursor blink. "Honestly, I didn't have a plan. I saw you going toward the elevator and something in me just moved. I didn't think it through. I knew who you were and you were about to leave, and I couldn't let you leave without you knowing that I knew. That's not like you," he wrote. "You always think things through." "I know." Then, "You're the only thing in the last 8 months that I've consistently failed to think through properly." He stared at the screen for a long time. He didn't know what to do with that either. He was building up a collection of things he didn't know what to do with, all related to the same woman, all pressing against each other in the same corner of his chest. "I need some time to sit with this," he finally wrote. "Okay? I'm not disappearing. I just need to think." "I know. Take the time." A pause. "For what it's worth, Ma, and I understand if it's not worth much right now, I'm glad you didn't leave." He closed the laptop. He sat in the dark of his bedroom for a while. Not spiral thinking. He wasn't built for that. It required a kind of self-indulgence he'd never had the luxury of. More just letting it sit. The shape of it. The fact that someone who had known him without seeing him had then come to see him, and had chosen to, and had said it was real. He'd been used before. Not dramatically. Not in the ways of someone who had a dramatic story to tell. Just the small, accumulating ways that life in his particular position operated. The credit taken, the contribution absorbed, the expertise borrowed without acknowledgement. He'd learned to expect it, had built his identity partly around not needing it to be otherwise. And now, someone was telling him the opposite, and he didn't have a framework for it, and the part of him that was tired and practical and had bills on the kitchen counter was telling him to be careful, that things that seem like one thing often turn out to be another. The part of him that had spent 8 months talking honestly to a person called Nova, the part of him that, if pressed, had felt more like himself in those conversations than almost anywhere else in his adult life, was paying very different attention. He went to bed. He didn't sleep as quickly as the night before. The next few days moved in a way that felt suspended, normal on the surface, strange underneath. Mason came in early, did his work, ate at his desk, went home. He helped with homework and made dinner and fixed the handle on the bathroom cabinet that had been loose for 2 weeks, and sat with Sophie on the couch while she explained at length the complete internal politics of her second-grade class, which were more nuanced than several quarterly reports he'd read recently. But at the office, something had changed in the temperature of the floor. It was subtle at first. Dennis Holt stopped by his desk on Wednesday and asked, in a voice that was trying to sound casual, whether Mason had any follow-up communications with Evelyn Hart planned. Mason said no. Dennis nodded and walked away. On Thursday, Garrett Walsh, who was a senior analyst and who had, for 3 years, treated Mason with the specific indifference of someone who didn't consider him competition, came by to ask his opinion on a portfolio restructuring question. Something Walsh had never done once in the 3 years they'd worked on the same floor. Mason answered the question. Walsh thanked him. Something about the interaction felt like reconnaissance. On Friday morning, he arrived at 6:15 as usual and found 2 emails waiting for him. One was a revised assignment memo that removed him from a project he'd been leading, a risk assessment on a mid-sized institutional account, and reassigned it to a junior analyst named Tyler, who had been at the firm for 8 months and whose main qualification for the upgrade appeared to be that he was Brandon Cole's golf contact. The stated reason was resource reallocation. The second email was from Wickham's office. It was not addressed to Mason specifically. It was a department-wide communication about the upcoming partnership discussions with Hartwell Global, and it listed the team who would be involved. Mason's name was not on it. He read both emails twice. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the window where the Miami morning was coming in pale and flat over the water. He thought about the Wickham meeting 3 days ago and the specific texture of Wickham's voice when Mason had said no, and Wickham had said think about it. He had thought about it. He'd given his answer, and now the institution was giving its answer back. He should have been surprised. He wasn't. This was the thing about working somewhere long enough to understand how it actually functioned. The surprises stopped being surprising and just became confirmation of things you'd already suspected. He'd suspected that refusing Wickham would cost him something. He just hadn't known how fast. He pulled up the risk assessment he'd been removed from and spent the morning writing a thorough transition document for Tyler, covering every element of the project in the kind of clear, detailed language that Tyler would need because Tyler genuinely didn't have the background for it yet. It took 3 hours. Nobody asked him to do it. Nobody would know he'd done it. But the client's money was real, and the risk was real, and the person now responsible for evaluating it was 26 years old and had never handled an account of that complexity, and Mason could either write the document or not, and he wrote the document. Brandon appeared at his shoulder at 11. "You heard about the Hartwell team," Brandon said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "You're not on it." "I noticed. Wickham's going direct. Walsh, Holt, a couple of the partners. They're putting together a pitch package for the partnership meeting." He paused. "I'm on it." Mason looked at him. Brandon had the look of someone who wasn't sure if he was winning or losing and needed to know. "Good," Mason said. Brandon waited. "That's it? Good? What do you want me to say, Brandon?" "I don't know. Something." He shifted his weight. "You sat with her for an hour and they're acting like you don't exist. Doesn't that bother you?" "Whether it bothers me doesn't change what it is." Brandon was quiet for a second. "You could reach out to her, tell her what they're doing." "Why would I do that?" "Because they're—" He stopped. Started again, dropping the voice. "They pushed you off a project you built. They're using your work to pitch to a woman who clearly wanted to talk to you and not them." "That's not nothing, Mason." It wasn't nothing. Mason knew it wasn't nothing, but he also knew the difference between something that was unfair and something that required a response, and he was not going to use his connection to Evelyn as leverage in an internal office politics situation. That was exactly the transaction he'd refused when Wickham offered it in reverse. "I'm not going to drag her into this," he said. Brandon looked at him with an expression that cycled through several things before landing on something that was adjacent to respect and seemed to make Brandon uncomfortable. "You're a strange person, Reed." "I know." Brandon walked away. Mason went back to the transition document. That night, after the kids were in bed, he opened his laptop. There was nothing from Nova, from Evelyn. He hadn't messaged her either. The space between their last exchange sat there, not hostile, just open. He thought about what Brandon had said. He thought about Wickham's face and the emails this morning and the way a place can tell you exactly what it thinks of you without ever saying it directly. He opened the message thread and typed, "They pulled me off my projects. I'm not on the Hartwell partnership team." The response came in 3 minutes. "I know." He stared at that. "You know. I have people who monitor developments at firms we're considering partnering with. It's standard practice. I saw the internal reshuffling." A pause. "I also know about the transition document you spent 3 hours writing this morning for the analyst who replaced you." Something about that hit him in a way he didn't expect. Not because she was watching, he understood the business logic of that, but because she'd noticed the document, the specific invisible thing he'd done. "How do you know about that?" Tyler forwarded it to the senior partners. He put his own name in the header, "But the work is recognizably yours." Another pause, then, "Does it bother you that he did that?" He thought about it honestly. "A little," he wrote. "Not as much as it used to." "Why not as much?" He looked at the question for a moment. Because I wrote it for the client. The client's going to be protected regardless of whose name is on it. That was the point. He could feel her thinking through the screen, which was a strange thing to feel but was consistent with 8 months of knowing how long her pauses meant what. This is exactly what I mean, she wrote. This is exactly what I've been trying to explain to you since April. What have you been trying to explain? That you think the way you work, the way you stay honest when it costs you, the way you put the actual work above the credit, the way you just wrote a document for 3 hours for a man who's going to put his name on it because the client mattered. I think you think that's just how work works, that everyone does it this way, or that it's the baseline. Isn't it? No. The answer was quick. Mason, no. It is absolutely not. He sat with that. Most people would have let Tyler sink, she wrote. Most people would have let the bad analysis go through and been available when it failed. Some people would have called me. You wrote a transition document. Tyler's 26, Mason wrote. He's not the one who made the decision to give him a project he's not ready for. I know. That's my point. A pause. You keep making me articulate things I usually just think. Has anyone told you that you do that? You have, several times. I mean, in person. He thought about it. His sister maybe once, years ago, before his life had become what it was. A professor in college. Not recently. Not recently, he wrote. That's a waste, she said. He didn't respond to that right away. He looked at the window. The city was quieter at this hour, the traffic reduced to a low hum rather than the constant press of it. He thought about the promotion Wickham had offered and that he'd refused, and the reassignment that had come 2 days later, and the fact that his daughter wanted a stuffed rabbit, and his hot water heater needed to be replaced, and the money for both of those things came from a job where he was now being systematically made smaller. He thought about what it cost to have integrity in a place that only valued it in theory. He typed, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes. Why didn't you just reach out through professional channels? When you figured out who I was, you could have contacted me as Evelyn Hart, offer a job interview, a consultation, whatever. Why the gala?" A long pause, longer than usual. "Because I was afraid," she wrote. He read that twice. He had not expected that word from her. Afraid of what? That you'd be different. That you'd find out who I was and become someone else. Careful and performative and focused on impressing me. That the person I'd been talking to for 8 months would disappear into whatever people become when I'm Evelyn Hart instead of Nova. A pause. You were the first person in a very long time who talked to me like a person. I didn't want to trade that for a professional relationship. He sat with that for a long moment. But you came to the gala. I couldn't not. I'd been watching you get diminished for 6 weeks by people who were using your work. I couldn't watch you walk out of a room without you knowing that someone saw it. He pressed his hands flat on the desk. Outside, a car passed in the street below. Somewhere in the apartment, Lily's sound machine hummed. "You're complicated," he typed. "Yes," she agreed. "I know. I'm sorry about that. I didn't say it was a problem." Another pause. "No," she wrote. "You didn't." He sat there for another minute. Then, "I'm not fine with all of it. I need you to know that. The 8 months of you knowing and me not knowing. I don't have the full shape of it yet. How I feel about it? Okay. But I don't think you were doing it to use me or hurt me. I believe that." "Thank you," she wrote, and the words were simple enough that he believed they meant what they said. "I need to go to bed," he wrote. 6:15 alarm. "I know." A pause. "Mason. Yeah. The document you wrote today, the 3 hours, that's who you are. Whatever they're doing at Black Ridge, whatever happens with the partnership meeting, that's who you are. Don't let them make you forget that." He closed the laptop. He sat in the dark room for a while. His back hurt. The bills were on the counter. The hot water heater was a next month problem again. His kids were asleep in various configurations of blankets and stuffed animals, and the comfortable noise they made just existing. He thought about her word, afraid. He thought about himself at 27, 28, before the life he had now had fully formed around him, before the weight of it. And it was a weight he'd chosen, had never regretted, but a weight nonetheless. Before all of that had settled into his bones, and he'd started moving like a man carrying something heavy all the time. He'd been afraid of things then too, different things, the kind of fears you could still name out loud. He didn't know yet what was happening with Evelyn Hart. He didn't know what it was allowed to be, or what he had the capacity for, or whether the distance between their two lives, the 11 billion under management and the hot water heater fund, was the kind of distance that stayed distance, or the kind that was just geography and could be crossed. He knew she had been real with him. In 8 months and in 2 conversations, and in the specific way she'd written tonight, afraid. He knew the document he'd spent 3 hours on today was sitting in someone else's name and would probably get that person a commendation when the Hartwell meeting went well. And he knew that Wickham would keep pushing the isolation until something gave. He knew that his 3 kids were safe in this apartment tonight. He knew Mrs. Delgado was 1 floor down. He knew Caleb's history test had come back with a B+, which Caleb had announced with the precision of someone reporting mildly favorable weather. And Lily had not yet given up on the idea of Gerald having a companion, and Sophie had very firm opinions about the internal politics of 2nd grade. He knew what he'd refused. He knew what it had cost. He knew somewhere under all of it that he was not the kind of person who became a different kind of person just because the room stopped watching. That had to be enough. He went to bed. The alarm would come at 5:47, the way it always did. The world would be exactly what it was. And somewhere across the city, in a different kind of apartment, the person who had built $11 billion out of nothing and who had been afraid to tell him the truth for 6 weeks was probably awake. Because she'd said once, back in June, one of the late nights, that she didn't sleep well in cities, that the hum of them kept some part of her brain running that she couldn't switch off. He told her she needed to find the quiet inside the noise, rather than waiting for the noise to stop. She'd asked how you did that. He told her he'd been learning for 3 years and would let her know when he figured it out. He still hadn't figured it out. But tonight, against most odds, lying in the dark with the city outside his window and 3 children breathing in the next rooms, and a job that was quietly, carefully working to make him disappear. Tonight he was close to something like quiet. Not peace, exactly. He was too honest for that word, but close. The reassignment memo was just the beginning. Mason understood this the way you understand weather. Not because someone told you a storm was coming, but because you'd lived long enough to read the pressure in the air. He'd been in enough institutions to know how they managed inconvenient people. They didn't fire them outright, usually. That created paperwork, potential disputes, a record of the decision. What they did instead was smaller and more sustained. They moved you to the margins, redirected the work that mattered to people who would be appropriately grateful, and waited for you to either fall in line or leave on your own. It was a kind of organizational patience that Mason had always found, on some level, grimly impressive. What he hadn't expected was how fast Blackridge would move. Within 10 days of his meeting with Wickham, 3 more projects disappeared from his queue. Not dramatically. No confrontations, no stated reasons beyond the language of resource allocation and team restructuring, which were the professional equivalents of a polite door closed in your face. The Meridian account review, which he'd been preparing to take on, went to Garrett Walsh instead. A macro risk brief he'd been asked to write for a client presentation in 2 weeks was quietly reassigned to a team he wasn't on. His calendar, which had been full enough to require actual management, thinned out to the point where he had meeting-free mornings that felt less like freedom and more like a quarantine. The cruelest part, and Mason thought about this on the drive home one Thursday evening while NPR said things he wasn't absorbing. The cruelest part was that they kept him in the building. They hadn't let him go. He still had a desk. He still had his title. He was still functionally employed, still pulling his base salary, still theoretically a member of the risk analysis division. But the substance had been quietly removed and the shell left standing, the way you can gut a house from the inside and still leave the walls up. He came in at 6:15. He worked on what was left of his assignments, which was meaningful work but increasingly peripheral. He ate lunch at his desk. He went home. He helped with homework, made dinner, checked on the kids. He lay in bed staring at the water stain and ran numbers he already knew the answer to and tried not to let the creeping anxiety of it bleed into the hours he was with his children, because they didn't deserve that. And because the thing about being the only parent in the room is that there's no one to take the shift when you need 5 minutes. Caleb noticed something first, which didn't surprise Mason. Caleb had always been perceptive in the way of quiet kids who watch more than they speak. He'd been that way at 4 years old, still doing it at 14. One Saturday afternoon, they were at the kitchen table together, Caleb ostensibly doing homework and Mason ostensibly reviewing a document, but actually staring at the same paragraph for the fourth time without retaining it, and Caleb said, without looking up, "Is work bad right now?" Mason put down the document. "What makes you ask that?" "You're doing the face." "What face?" "The one where you're looking at something, but you're not actually looking at it." Caleb finally looked up. He had Mason's eyes, which was a thing Mason noticed sometimes, and then immediately stopped thinking about because the geometry of it, how a person could be inside you and then outside you, walking around with your eyes in a whole separate life, was something his brain handled only in brief doses. "You've been doing it for like 2 weeks. Mason looked at his son for a moment. 14 years old. Bone-thin the way teenage boys get, in the stage where the height was arriving before the rest of him had caught up, wearing a shirt from a band Mason didn't recognize. Sharp. Too sharp sometimes, in the way that was a gift that would cost him something later. "Work's complicated right now," Mason said. "Nothing you need to worry about." "I'm not worried," Caleb said. "I'm just asking. There's some stuff happening with people at work. Politics kind of thing. It'll work itself out." Caleb considered this with the particular skepticism of a teenager who has learned that adult reassurances are not always structurally sound. "Will it, though?" "Probably," Mason said, which was not the same as yes, but was the most honest answer he had. Caleb went back to his homework. After a minute, he said, "Tyler from my school's brother works at some finance place, and he said his boss takes credit for everything he does, and he's thinking about quitting." "That happens a lot in finance." "Does it happen to you?" Mason looked at him. "Sometimes." "That sucks." "Yeah." "You should do something about it." "I'm working on it." Caleb nodded and went back to his textbook. He didn't push it further, which was both a relief and somehow slightly difficult. Mason had gotten used to being the one who absorbed and processed the hard things silently, and there was something about being seen by his own kid in this ordinary Saturday kitchen moment that hit differently than he expected. He went back to the paragraph he'd been staring at. This time he actually read it. The conversations with Evelyn continued, but they had shifted in texture. They were still happening on the forum, through the same channel they'd always used, but they were different now, carrying more weight on both sides, both of them more careful in some ways and more honest in others. The way conversations change when you know who you're actually talking to. She asked about the reassignments. He told her the outline. She listened without doing the thing people often did, which was jumping immediately to solutions or advice. She just received it, which was more valuable than he would have thought. "What are you going to do?" she wrote one night. "Keep working," he wrote back. "At Blackridge. For now." "Mason." A pause. "They're deliberately diminishing you." "I know. And you're just going to—" "I'm not going to use you as leverage," he wrote, and he said it evenly, but he felt the edge in it. "I know that's where this is going, and I understand why, but I made a decision and I'm not changing it because things got harder." A long pause on her end. "I wasn't suggesting that." "Then what were you suggesting?" "I was asking what you plan to do. That's different." Another pause. "You can make plans that don't involve me. You're allowed to have options that exist independently of whatever is or isn't happening between us." He sat with that. It was fair. He knew it was fair. The trouble was that the options that existed independently were limited in ways that had nothing to do with the situation at Blackridge and everything to do with the life he was maintaining around it. Walking out of a job without another one lined up was a particular kind of risk that people with savings and singular lives could absorb in ways that he couldn't. His math wasn't that math. His margin wasn't that margin. "I know," he wrote. "I'm not being stubborn. I'm being practical." "You can be both." "I know that too." She didn't push. He appreciated that she didn't push. Whatever was developing between them, and he still didn't have a clean name for it, was still navigating the terrain of it in the dark. One of the things he'd understood about her from the first months online was that she was direct without being forceful. She stated her position clearly, and then she let you have yours. It was, in his experience, rarer than it should have been. The Hartwell partnership meetings were scheduled to begin the third week of November. Mason knew because Brandon told him. Brandon had become a peculiar presence in this period. Not exactly an ally, but no longer quite positioned as the antagonist he'd been. He stopped by Mason's desk with the frequency of someone checking on something they felt partially responsible for, which he was, and which Mason suspected he knew. First meeting's Tuesday, Brandon said one Monday morning. Walsh, Holt, and Wickham are heading it up. I'm on the support team. He paused. They built the whole pitch around the EM exposure analysis, the currency mismatch piece. Mason kept his eyes on his screen. I know. Your work. I know, Brandon. It's going under Holt's name in the presentation materials. I know that too. Brandon was quiet for a second. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. Does it bother you that I'm on it? I could try to get you back in. I still have some... Don't, Mason said. Don't do that. Do the work, do it well. Don't let the analysis get diluted because someone wants to oversimplify the hedge correlation piece. That matters more than attribution. Brandon looked at him with the expression he'd been wearing increasingly in the past 3 weeks. The one that was difficult to categorize, somewhere between guilt and education. You're a better person than I am, he said. He said it without irony, which was unusual for him. You're 29, Mason said. You've got time. Brandon almost laughed. He walked back to his desk. Tuesday came. Mason arrived at 6:15, made his way to the 21st floor, and spent the morning working on a sector analysis that no one had asked for but that the Pemberton client needed and wasn't going to get from anyone else given the current distribution of the division's attention. He knew the Hartwell meeting was happening in the 24th floor conference room at 10. He didn't go upstairs. He didn't intend to. He had no reason to be there and hadn't been invited, and he was not going to stand in a hallway hoping to be noticed. He worked. The morning passed. He ate lunch at his desk. Priya stopped by around 1:30, which she'd been doing with more frequency lately, not talking about the situation directly but checking in the way of someone who felt complicit by proximity and was managing it the only way available to them, which was showing up. How'd the morning treat you? She asked. Fine. You? Meeting ran long. She didn't say which meeting. They both knew. Wickham did most of the talking. Walsh presented the analysis. A pause. It was your analysis, Mason. I know you know that. I just want you to know that I know that. The analysis is solid regardless. It's more than solid. If Hartwell bites on this, it's going to be one of the biggest partnerships we've made in 5 years. She pressed her lips together. And Holt is going to get a bonus for work you did. Probably. Doesn't that... She'd stopped herself. Yes, he said. It does, but being angry about it in this conversation doesn't change the outcome. She nodded slowly. She had the look of someone who wanted to say something else and had decided against it. She went back to her desk. The meeting apparently went well enough that Wickham's assistant sent a department-wide email at 3:15 announcing that discussions with Hartwell Global were progressing productively, and that a follow-up session had been scheduled for the following week. The email did not mention Mason by name. The analysis that was progressing productively had been written by him over 6 weeks in the early mornings before anyone else arrived on the floor, but the email did not mention that either. He finished the Pemberton sector analysis at 4:50 and sent it to the client contact directly, which was mildly irregular but within his authority, and which he did because Holt had stopped reading his internal reports and someone needed to actually see it. Then he packed up his bag and went downstairs and drove home in the specific silence of a man managing something. That night was harder than most. Not outwardly. He made pasta, helped Lily with a reading comprehension worksheet that featured a story about a girl who found a lost puppy, which prompted a 20-minute detour about whether they could get a dog, which Mason navigated with the patience of someone who had explained fiscal constraints to a 9-year-old several times before without ever using those exact words. He got Sophie to bed on schedule. He went over Caleb's English essay, which was about whether ambition was a virtue or a flaw, and which was, Mason thought, quietly excellent, even if the thesis needed tightening. But after everyone was in bed and the apartment was quiet, he sat at his desk and didn't open the laptop right away. He sat in the dark and let himself feel the weight of the day without immediately finding a way to process it into something manageable. He was tired. Not just the daily tired that had been operating as background noise for 3 years. The other kind. The kind that sits underneath the surface kind and is about something larger than sleep. He'd done the right thing. He believed that completely. He'd refused to use Evelyn, refused to weaponize something personal against a professional situation, refused to bend the way Wickham had wanted him to bend. He'd done the right thing, and the consequence of doing the right thing was watching his work get attributed to other people in meetings he wasn't invited to, watching a partnership get built on his analysis while his own profile at the company got methodically smaller. He'd known this was possible. He'd made the choice knowing this was possible. That didn't make the sitting with it any easier. He opened the laptop. There was already a message waiting. "I was in the building today," she'd written. It had come in 2 hours ago. He stared at that, then typed, "I didn't know that. Second meeting with the Blackridge team, 24th floor." A pause. "I knew you were in the building. I almost sent something, decided against it." "Why?" "Because I didn't want you to feel like I was watching over you. You're not a project, Mason." He read that twice. "What did you think of the meeting?" A pause. Then, "Truthfully? Always. The analysis is excellent. The presentation of it was adequate. Walsh clearly didn't write it. There were questions he couldn't answer that anyone who'd built the model would have known immediately. Wickham talked too much. Holt deferred on every technical question." Another pause. "I sat there for 90 minutes listening to people present your work and not understand it." He felt something tighten in his chest. "Did you say anything?" "Not yet." "Evelyn, not yet," she repeated. "I want you to understand something. What I do next, I'm not doing for you. I'm doing it because I run a business, and I don't make partnership decisions based on salesmanship. I make them based on the quality of the thinking behind the numbers. And the thinking I'm being shown is yours, and the people showing it to me can't defend it under examination. And that is a material fact about the firm I'm being asked to enter a significant financial relationship with." He sat with that for a long moment. The precision of it. The way she separated the business from the personal, stated both clearly, didn't pretend they weren't both real. "Okay," he wrote. "I'm going to ask for a third meeting," she wrote, "and I'm going to ask that the analyst who built the currency exposure model be present to walk through the methodology." His hands went still on the keyboard. "They'll push back," he wrote. "I expect so. Wickham will say the team is..." Wickham can say whatever he wants. "I'm the client in this negotiation. I'm asking for a specific thing that is entirely reasonable given the scope of what's being proposed." A pause. "They can say no. If they say no, I'll draw my own conclusions about why and act accordingly." He stared at the screen. "You're going to force their hand." "I'm going to ask a professional question and let them answer it." "That's the same thing." "Yes," she said, "it is." He pressed the heels of his hands against the desk. He thought about Wickham's office and the chair that was slightly lower than Wickham's chair. He thought about the email at 3:15 with its language of productive discussions and its omission of his name. He thought about Caleb saying you should do something about it on a Saturday afternoon in the kitchen. "If this goes badly," he started. "I know." "No, I mean, if they fire me over this, or if the whole thing becomes..." "Mason." Her message interrupted his typing. "I understand what you're risking. I wouldn't do this if I weren't certain about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it." "Are you certain?" A longer pause than usual. "About the business decision? Yes? About everything else?" Another pause. "I'm working on it." He almost smiled. It was the most human thing she'd ever said to him, and she'd said a lot of human things. "Okay?" he typed. "Okay?" "Do what you need to do. I'll deal with what comes. You're not going to fight me on this. You said you're doing it for your own business reasons. I'm not going to argue with someone who's acting in their own interest." "That's not the whole truth." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He closed the laptop and went to bed and slept badly, which was honest. The request came 2 days later. Renata delivered it to Wickham via email from Hartwell Global's deal team, a formal request that the analyst responsible for the risk framework model, specifically the currency mismatch exposure work, be present at the third meeting to walk through the methodology. The email was professional and specific, and as Evelyn had predicted, left very little room for maneuvering. Mason heard about it the way he heard about most things these days. Not directly, but through the atmosphere of the floor. He was at his desk at 8:40 in the morning when he became aware that the particular quality of activity near the elevator banks had changed, the way weather changes a room before it arrives. Brandon materialized at his desk at 9:15 with the expression of someone delivering news he had complicated feelings about. "Wickham called a partner meeting," Brandon said. 20 minutes ago, emergency slot. Mason kept his eyes on his screen. About? About Hartwell's request. He lowered his voice. "They want you in the third meeting." The floor around them had the quality of a room full of people pretending to work while actually listening. Mason could feel it. "What's Wickham doing about it?" "That's what the partner meeting is for." Brandon exhaled. "They can't just say no. She's the client. She's asking a reasonable question about methodology. Saying no basically tells her you don't have the technical bench to support the analysis, which is the truth, but they can't admit it." He paused. "They're stuck." Okay. Mason, they're in there right now deciding whether to... Brandon. Mason finally looked up. "What do you want me to do with this information?" Brandon opened his mouth and then closed it. "I don't know," he admitted. "I just thought you should know." "I do know, thank you." He went back to work. The partner meeting lasted 45 minutes. At 11:10, Dennis Holt appeared at Mason's desk. He was wearing the face of a man delivering a message he personally disagreed with and had decided to frame as neutrally as possible. "The Hartwell third meeting," Holt said. "We need you in it." Mason looked at him. "I thought I wasn't on the partnership team." "We're making an adjustment." "What kind of adjustment?" Holt had the grace to look uncomfortable. "You'll be presenting the currency exposure methodology. Walsh will lead the overall presentation. You'll come in for the technical section." "So I come in, present the work, and leave?" "Essentially." "Is my name going on the analysis materials?" Holt blinked. "The materials are already... I know what the materials say. I'm asking if they're going to be corrected before the meeting." Holt was quiet for a second. "I'll look into that." "I'd appreciate it," Mason said, and went back to his screen. Holt stood there a moment longer, apparently recalibrating, and then walked away. Mason heard him get on the phone 30 seconds later, voice low, somewhere near the copy room. He didn't try to listen. He went back to the Pemberton follow-up and finished it by noon. The correction to the materials didn't come. He'd known it probably wouldn't. That particular battle was too established in the firm's internal record to be unwound in 72 hours just because a client had asked a question. He wasn't going to make it a condition of his attendance. The client mattered. The analysis mattered. He would walk into the room and present work that was his and that he could defend with his eyes closed, and Evelyn Hart would be sitting across the table from him. And he would do his job the way he always did his job, which was well and without requiring anyone's permission to do it. The night before the meeting, he didn't message her. He wanted to. He'd picked up his phone 3 times and put it down. He didn't want it to be a coordination, a strategy. They'd agreed, in the way that didn't require explicit stating, that what happened in that conference room would happen on its own terms. He helped Sophie with the spelling worksheet instead. She was learning words with silent letters and was personally offended by the existence of the letter K in night. "Why is it there if it doesn't do anything?" she asked, with the reasonable fury of a 7-year-old encountering systemic illogic for the first time. "Some things are there for historical reasons that made sense once," Mason told her. "That's dumb." "Sometimes, yeah." She wrote the word correctly and moved on to wrench, with renewed suspicion of the alphabet. He put her to bed. He checked on Caleb, who was fine, and Lily, who had acquired, by means Mason hadn't fully investigated, a new stuffed rabbit that was sitting next to Gerald and appeared to have been named Margaret. He stood in the hall between their rooms for a second. Then he went to bed, set the alarm for 5:15, earlier than usual, and lay in the dark with the city outside his window and the white noise from Lily's room and the specific quality of the night before something happens. He woke up before the alarm. He dressed in the dark, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window looking at the parking lot below where the orange light of the early morning made everything look briefly like a painting of itself. He thought about what he was walking into. He thought about the chair that was lower than Wickham's and the room full of people who had spent 6 weeks making him smaller, and the woman on the other side of the table who had come to a rooftop and said, "Don't." He thought about what it cost to stay honest in a room designed to cost you that. He drank the coffee. He left before the kids woke up, which he almost never did, and left a note on the kitchen table that said, "Eggs in the fridge, love you, call if you need anything." The same note he'd left the 3 times before in 3 years that he'd had early mornings they couldn't know about. The meeting was at 10. He arrived at 6:15 because that was when he arrived, because the floor was his in the early morning, and he needed those 2.5 hours to be completely inside the work before the world started pressing in. He pulled up the full model. He went through every layer of it, the assumptions, the data sources, the correlation structure, the stress scenarios. Not because he'd forgotten any of it, because he wanted every number to be alive in his hands when he walked into that room. At 9:50, he took the elevator to the 24th floor. The conference room was the large one at the corner, floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, the bay visible on one horizon, the city on the other. Walsh was already there, setting up his presentation on the screen with the careful movements of someone who was managing anxiety through action. Holt was talking to one of the partners near the credenza. 2 other analysts from the partnership team were arranging materials. Wickham stood near the window with his phone, doing the thing where you look at it to avoid looking at the room. When Mason walked in, Wickham looked up. Something shifted in his expression. Not hostility, not warmth. Assessment. "Mason," he said. "Mr. Wickham. Ready for this?" "Yes." Wickham held his gaze for a second. "We need this to go well." "I know. The partnership is important to the firm." "I know that too." Another beat. Then Wickham looked back at his phone, which was as close to acknowledged as that conversation was going to get. The Hartwell team arrived at 10:02. 4 people from their deal team, 2 senior advisors, and then Evelyn Hart. She was in a gray suit, hair back, and she walked into the room the same way she'd walked into the gala. Not performing it, just entering it. Her eyes moved across the room with the efficient survey of someone cataloging information, and when they landed on Mason, they stopped for less than a second and moved on. That half second was enough. He felt it in his chest the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure. Something settling, something confirmed. He was here. She was here. The work was here. Whatever happened next would happen on real terms. She sat down across the table. The Blackridge partners arranged themselves with the particular choreography of a group that had rehearsed this but not rehearsed it enough. Walsh opened his laptop. Holt adjusted his jacket. Mason sat at the far end of the Blackridge side, slightly removed from the formation, which was either intentional or the result of no one explicitly including him in the seating arrangement. He put his materials on the table. He folded his hands. He waited. Walsh began the overview. He was competent at presentation, smooth, practiced, the kind of delivery that came from years of talking to client rooms and learning their rhythms. He moved through the market landscape, the portfolio approach, the firm's track record. Mason listened and watched Evelyn's team. The senior advisors were taking notes. The deal team was watching the screen. Evelyn was watching Walsh with an expression that was professional and attentive and giving absolutely nothing away. 20 minutes in, Walsh transitioned to the risk framework. "The core of our analytical approach," he said, "is a proprietary exposure model that identifies nonlinear risk concentrations in institutional portfolios. I'll turn it over to our analysts to walk through the methodology." Every eye in the room went to Holt, who was the name on the materials. Holt did not stand up. A beat of silence, with the particular texture of a room realizing something has gone wrong. Mason stood up. He didn't look at Wickham. He didn't look at Holt. He pulled up the model on his laptop, connected it to the screen, and began. "The framework starts with a problem that standard correlation models don't capture well," he said. His voice came out level. Clear. The exhaustion and the politics and the previous 6 weeks were somewhere in him, but they were not in his voice. In diversified EM portfolios, the traditional approach to hedge construction uses historical correlation data from volatility regimes that don't apply to current conditions. The result is a hedge that looks sufficient on paper but is structurally undersized in ways that only become visible under stress. He walked them through it. Every layer. The data architecture, the regime switching assumption, the stress scenarios he'd modeled over 6 weeks of early mornings and late nights. He answered questions from the Hartwell advisors, precise, technically specific questions, the kind designed to determine whether the person presenting actually understands what they built. He answered everyone without consulting notes. He was 40 minutes into it when Evelyn spoke for the first time. The third stress scenario, she said, the one where the hedge correlation breaks down to 40% of the modeled value. What's your confidence interval on that deterioration rate? The room was very quiet. Walsh had a tablet in his hands and was looking at it in the way of someone hoping something useful would appear on it. Mason looked directly at her. The 90% confidence interval runs from 32 to 58% of modeled correlation. The 40% point estimate is the median of a right-skewed distribution. The tail risk runs significantly worse. I can walk through the distribution if that's useful. Please, she said. He walked through the distribution. It took 11 minutes. When he finished, the room had the quality of a space where something has shifted without anyone officially announcing it. Evelyn looked at her lead advisor, who gave a small nod. Then she looked at Mason. Not at Walsh. Not at Wickham. At Mason. Thank you, she said. That's very clear. It was a professional sentence. 2 words that meant nothing in isolation. But the way she said it, the particular weight of someone saying something they mean entirely, landed in the room differently than the rest of the words that had been said in it. Wickham was watching from his end of the table. Walsh was watching. Holt was watching. Every person in the room understood that something had just been exposed, not through accusation, but through the simple act of a question being answered by the person who could actually answer it. The meeting wrapped up 40 minutes later. Evelyn's deal team collected their materials. Handshakes were exchanged. Wickham was talking. More than usual, which meant he was managing something. Mason had stepped back from the table and was gathering his materials and not doing the post-meeting networking that the senior people were performing, because it wasn't his role, and he wasn't going to insert himself into it. He was near the door when Evelyn appeared at his shoulder. She was carrying her folio and had the brisk posture of someone on a timeline, which she was. Her team was waiting in the hallway. The Pemberton sector brief, she said quietly, at a volume that didn't carry to the rest of the room. From 3 weeks ago. Your client contact forwarded it to us. They're a secondary investor in a fund we advise. I read it last week. He looked at her. Okay. It was good, she said. Just that. But her eyes said more than the words, said several things at once that weren't appropriate for a conference room with Wickham 15 feet away. Said, I see you. I see all of it. I saw the whole thing. Then she was gone, through the door, into the hallway, her team falling into step around her with the practiced efficiency of people who knew how she moved and matched their pace to it. Mason stood in the conference room for a moment after she left. Walsh was talking to one of the partners. Wickham was on his phone. Holt was gathering his things with the movements of a man who wanted to be somewhere else. Mason picked up his materials. He straightened them against the table. The model was still on the screen. The distribution curve he'd walked through, the stress scenarios, 6 weeks of early mornings visible to anyone who wanted to look at the shape of the work. Nobody looked at the screen. He walked to the elevator, rode it back to 21, sat down at his desk. The floor was moving around him at normal speed. Phones ringing, keyboards going, the low continuous hum of a building doing its financial business. Everything exactly the same as it had been this morning. Except that it wasn't. He knew it wasn't. He didn't know yet what it was instead. Didn't know what Wickham's team would do next, whether the partnership would proceed, whether the exposure of this morning would result in anything beyond a temporarily uncomfortable room. He didn't know what was happening on the other side of the building with Evelyn's team, or what she was saying to her advisors right now. He knew he'd done the work. He knew he'd walked into a room and answered every question. He knew that when she'd asked the one that mattered most, he'd had the answer. He opened the Pemberton file and started on the follow-up. His back hurt. His coffee had gone cold. The city outside the window was doing its late morning thing, all that noise and motion and the ordinary relentlessness of it. He worked. That was the thing about Mason Reed. Whatever else was happening, whatever was being taken from him, or arranged against him, or prepared to unravel, he worked. Not because he didn't feel the rest of it. He felt the rest of it fine. But the work was his in a way that the rest of it wasn't. And that particular ownership, the thing they could reassign and rename and present under other people's credentials but could never actually take from him, was the piece of himself he protected most. He worked until 6:15. He drove home. He made dinner. He helped Sophie understand why the K in night existed, even though it wasn't fair. He checked on the rabbits, Gerald and Margaret, which were both fine. He sat at the kitchen table with Caleb, and they talked about the English essay, tightening the thesis. And Caleb said something sharp and precise about the difference between ambition and desperation that made Mason stop and look at him and think, "Where did you come from?" He put his kids to bed. He washed the dishes. He stood at the kitchen window and looked at the parking lot below in the dark. His phone was on the counter. He picked it up and looked at it. Nothing yet. He hadn't expected anything yet. He put it down and went to bed. The water stain was still there. His back still hurt. But somewhere in the 24th floor conference room he'd walked into this morning, as the man they'd made peripheral, he had stood up and answered every question. And Evelyn Hart, Nova, had looked at him across a table full of people who had spent 6 weeks arranging his disappearance. And she had said, "Thank you, that's very clear." He was still carrying those words home carefully, the way he'd carried something across the rooftop 3 weeks ago, like something he didn't want to put down in the dark. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow the alarm would come at 5:47. He'd be up before it. The days after the third meeting had a particular suspended quality, the way air feels before a weather system fully commits to arriving. Mason came in at 6:15, did his work, went home. The floor at Blackridge moved around him with the slightly altered energy of a place where something has happened but no one has officially addressed it yet. The specific institutional holding of breath that precedes a decision being made somewhere above the level where regular people operate. Nobody said anything to him directly. Not Holt, not Walsh, not Wickham. Brandon stopped by his desk on Thursday morning and asked with studied casualness whether he'd heard anything. Mason said no. Brandon nodded and went back to his desk with the energy of a man running calculations he hadn't finished yet. Priya brought him coffee on Friday without being asked, which was a small thing and which he accepted without making it into more than it was, but which he registered. He talked to Evelyn that Friday night. Brief, she had an early flight, some board obligation in New York that she'd mentioned in passing the week before. She asked how the floor felt. He told her suspended. She said that made sense. He asked what was happening on her end, and she said she was still working through the evaluation, that she didn't rush decisions of this scope, that there were things she needed to think through carefully before she moved. He told her he understood. She said she knew he did. He went to bed and lay there longer than usual, turning things over. He was not someone who dealt well with suspension, not because he was impatient, but because suspension required tolerating uncertainty about things that were pressing against the rest of his life. The hot water heater had finally given up entirely on Tuesday. He'd been managing with cold showers for 3 days, which was less catastrophic than it sounded, but was the particular indignity of a man who had run the numbers a dozen times and kept arriving at the same tight arithmetic. The bill for it was sitting on the counter next to the other bills, this one with a sticky note from the plumber that said the unit needed replacement, not repair, which was the more expensive of the two possible outcomes, and therefore the one that had happened. He took cold showers. He kept working. He did not ask Evelyn for anything. The following Monday, Richard Wickham called him into the 24th floor office at 2 in the afternoon. Mason rode the elevator with the awareness of a man who has learned to keep his face neutral while his mind runs the possible scenarios. Renata showed him in with the particular stillness of someone who knows the contents of a meeting she isn't in. The office was the same. The chair was still the lower one. Mason sat in it. Wickham was behind the desk. He looked, not angry, Mason thought, but reconfigured, like someone who had spent the weekend moving pieces around a board and had arrived at an arrangement that satisfied neither side but was the only stable one available. "The Hartwell situation," Wickham began. Mason waited. "Evelyn Hart's team has indicated they want to continue partnership discussions." He paused on that as if weighing something. "They've also indicated that the terms of any partnership are contingent on certain structural assurances about the analytical capacity of the team they'd be working with." "What kind of assurances?" Wickham looked at him directly. "They want you specifically attached to any joint advisory structure, named in the agreement. Not a team, not a division. You." The office was very quiet. The HVAC moved through it. "I see," Mason said. "It puts us in a difficult position," Wickham said. The language was careful. Us, not me, the institutional plural that distributed discomfort. "We've been running the partnership process without you at the forefront, Adjusting that now, adjusting it to accurately reflect who built the work you've been presenting, Mason said. He said it without heat, just as a clarification. Wickham absorbed that. His expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. The slight reframing that happens when someone decides not to contest a thing they know is true. Yes, he said. That. What are you asking me? I'm asking whether you're willing to be part of the Hartwell partnership team going forward, with appropriate recognition and compensation adjusted to reflect the scope of the role. Mason looked at him. The afternoon light was coming through the corner windows at an angle that made the bay outside look almost abstract, just color and motion. He thought about the note he'd sent Holt in October that had come back with someone else's name on it. He thought about Tyler and the transition document. He thought about the email at 3:15 that had used the word productively without mentioning his name once. What does appropriate compensation mean specifically? He said. Wickham named a number. It was a real number, so not transformative, not life-changing in the way of someone whose life has a lot of room to be changed, but real. Enough to replace the hot water heater without a timing problem. Enough to give Lily a bedroom that wasn't a converted alcove with a curtain instead of a door. Enough to stop doing the math the way he'd been doing the math for 3 years. He sat with it for a moment. I need to think about it, he said. Wickham blinked. This was apparently not the response he'd prepared for. The Hartwell team is moving on a timeline. I understand the timeline, Mason said. I built the model they're evaluating. I understand the timeline very well. He stood up. I'll have an answer by Wednesday. Wickham looked at him across the desk. The desk with the chair that was slightly lower, in the office with the 4,000 square foot view, in the building where Mason had been arriving at 6:15 for 3 years and leaving invisible. Something in Wickham's expression, for the first time in all of those 3 years, was close to uncertainty. Not the discomfort of a man who'd been challenged, the discomfort of a man who was realizing, belatedly, what had been sitting at a desk on his 21st floor the entire time. Wednesday, Wickham confirmed. Mason rode the elevator back to 21. He sat down at his desk. He did not allow himself to have the reaction he could feel sitting in his chest, because the floor was not the place for it, and Brandon Cole was definitely watching from across the room. He opened his laptop and worked until 6:15. That night, after dinner, after the kids were in bed, after he'd stood in the kitchen looking at the hot water heater bill for approximately the 100th time, he opened his laptop and typed, "Wickham called me in today." Her response came in under 2 minutes, which meant she'd been at her computer. "I know," she wrote. "You know. My deal team communicated our conditions to their partnership committee this morning. I expected they'd move quickly." A pause. "How do you feel about it?" He thought about that. How did he feel? The answer was complicated in ways that required more than a sentence. "I feel like I'm being offered back something that was mine in the first place," he wrote, which is, I don't know. It's not nothing, but it's also not the same as it having been right. "No," she agreed. "It's not. He offered me a number. Is it fair? It's better than what I have. Whether it's fair in absolute terms is a different question." "What are you going to do?" He looked at the bills on the counter. The hot water heater note, the sticky note from the plumber. Gerald and Margaret sitting on a shelf in Lily's room, visible through the partially open door. Sophie's spelling worksheet on the kitchen table, still there because she'd wanted to show it to him again in the morning. The silent K in night circled in red because she'd gotten it right and wanted the evidence preserved. "I don't know yet," he wrote honestly. "Can I say something?" "You don't usually ask. This one's different." A pause. "I don't want you to take it because of me, or because of any pressure related to me. If you decide the offer is fair and the role is what you want and Blackridge is where you want to be, that's a real decision, and I'll respect it completely. But if you're taking it because you feel like you owe something to the situation we've—" She stopped, started again. "I need you to make this decision like I don't exist, like the rooftop didn't happen, like the only variables are you and your work and your kids and what you actually want." He read that twice. "You're making yourself not exist in my decision. I'm trying to make sure you don't factor me as an obligation. You're not an obligation. I know, but you're the kind of person who factors things. And I'm a variable in this situation, whether we want me to be or not. I want to make sure the variable I represent is clear. He thought about that for a long time. Outside, the city was doing its night thing. Lily's sound machine was audible from the hallway. The refrigerator hummed. The plumber's note sat on the counter in a handwriting that had no idea what kind of weight it had been assigned. "What are you offering me?" he typed, and then stopped, and then wrote what he actually meant. If what's happening between us becomes something real, what does that look like practically? I have 3 kids. I have a life that is not, I'm not a person with a lot of flexibility. I need to know what I'm actually considering before I can make any decision clearly. The pause was longer than usual, long enough that he wondered if he'd said too much, gotten too specific, broken whatever careful balance they'd been maintaining. Then, "I've been thinking about that since the gala," she wrote. "Honestly, I don't have a clean answer. I know what I want in general terms. I'm less sure about what's possible in practical terms. But I've never been the kind of person who decides something is impossible before trying to figure out what it would actually take. Your life is, I know what my life is. I built it. I also know what it doesn't have in it, and I've known for a while." A pause. "Your kids aren't a complication to me, Mason. I want you to understand that. They're part of who you are. The man I've been talking to for 8 months is a man who gets up at 5:15 to make sure his kids have what they need. I didn't fall for you in spite of that. I fell for you because of the whole picture." He sat with the word "fell" for a moment. Neither of them had used that word before. She'd used "afraid." She'd said things that circled around something without naming it directly, and he'd done the same because they were both careful people who had learned to be careful for their own separate reasons. But there it was now, sitting in a message on his screen at 10:40 at night in an apartment with bills on the counter and 3 kids sleeping in the next rooms. "Fell. I'm not a simple person to be with," he wrote. It came out almost like a warning, which was not quite what he meant, but was close enough. "I know that," she said. "I'm not simple either. We'd be 2 complicated people figuring out something hard." A pause. "I think that's better than the alternative." "What's the alternative?" 2 simple people who never have to figure out anything. He almost smiled. He was sitting alone at his desk in the dark, and he almost smiled. "Okay," he typed. "Okay what?" "Okay, I hear you. About making the decision independently." He looked at the counter. "I'm going to sleep on it." "Good," she said. "Mason, yeah. Whatever you decide, I'm not going anywhere. That's not contingent on your answer to Wickham." He held on to that. "I know," he wrote. He believed it. He closed the laptop. He looked at the plumber's note one more time. Then he went to bed. He didn't sleep right away. He lay there running the actual variables. Not the emotional ones, those he'd sit with later, but the arithmetic ones. The number Wickham had offered. The adjusted cost of living it would enable. The scope of the role as described, which was real work, and work he was capable of doing well. The alternative, which was staying in the same position he'd occupied for the past 3 weeks. Peripheral, managed down, technically employed but professionally diminished. He ran it honestly, without Evelyn in the equation, just him and 3 kids and the work and the math. The math said the offer was real. The other thing, the thing that wasn't math, said something different. He fell asleep before he resolved it, which was probably honest. He woke up before the alarm. 5:08. He lay there for 7 minutes and then got up because lying there wasn't resolving anything. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window in the dark. The parking lot was empty except for Mrs. Delgado's car and a truck that had been there since Friday. The city was quiet in the way it got in the hour before it fully woke up. He thought about 3 years of 6:15 arrivals, 3 years of work that went out under other people's names, 3 years of a place that had taken what he built and given him the shell of a position in return. He thought about Wickham's face when he'd said Wednesday and walked out, the uncertainty in it, the recalibration, the look of a man realizing something late. He thought about what Caleb had said on the Saturday in the kitchen. You should do something about it. He thought about what Evelyn had said. Make this decision like I don't exist. He drank his coffee. By 7 o'clock, kids awake, eggs on the stove, Sophie explaining to Gerald and Margaret that they needed to behave while she was at school, Caleb eating toast with the meditative focus of someone who was not yet fully conscious. Mason had made his decision, not the one that anyone at Blackridge was expecting. He called in at 8:30 and left a message with Renata that he would be in at 9 instead of his usual time. Then he drove Caleb and Lily to school, dropped Sophie at the program that took the younger ones in the morning, and sat in the school parking lot for 5 minutes doing nothing in particular. Then he drove to the office. He went to the 21st floor first. He sat at his desk. He opened a document and spent 45 minutes writing something he'd never written in 3 years at Blackridge. A full account of the work he'd done, the analyses he'd produced, the contributions that had been attributed elsewhere. He wasn't writing it as an accusation. He was writing it as a record, clear, specific, dated, the kind of document that required no one's acknowledgement to be true and that would exist regardless of what happened next. He saved it to his personal drive. He printed one copy. He folded it and put it in his inside jacket pocket. Then he took the elevator to the 24th floor and asked Renata to let Wickham know he had his answer. She showed him in at 10:15. Wickham was there, Walsh was there, and unexpected, which Mason registered in the half-second before his face settled. So was one of the founding partners, a man named Gerald Ashby, who appeared at the firm about twice a year and whom Mason had spoken to exactly once, at a company anniversary event where Ashby had confused him with someone from accounting. The addition of Ashby told Mason something. This meeting was being treated as more significant than a simple yes or no to a compensation offer. Wickham had assembled reinforcements. Mason sat in the lower chair. He looked at the three of them. "I've thought about the offer," he said. Wickham nodded. "And?" "I'm declining." The room went quiet in the way of a room that has been surprised. Walsh put down his pen. Ashby, who had the impassive quality of a man who had seen a great deal of business over 40 years and had learned to keep his face neutral, let something shift very slightly in his expression, something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. Wickham said, "Mason, I want to explain why," Mason said. "Not because I owe you an explanation, but because I think it's worth saying clearly." Wickham gestured with his hand, a go-ahead that was also a managing gesture, the kind that meant say your thing and let's move on. "I've been at this firm for 3 years, Mason said. In that time, I've built models that saved clients $11 million in a single quarter. I flagged the Albrecht derivatives exposure before it blew up. I wrote the currency mismatch analysis that is currently the centerpiece of the Hartwell partnership pitch. I wrote it alone before 6 in the morning over 6 weeks, and it went into presentation materials under someone else's name." He kept his voice even. "When I refused to use my relationship with Evelyn Hart as a business development tool, I was pulled from projects, excluded from meetings, and given work that had been specifically reduced in scope to reflect my new status as someone who had been inconvenient." Nobody spoke. Walsh was looking at the table. Ashby was watching Mason with an expression that had moved from impassive to something more active. "The offer you made me is a reaction to a client asking where the actual analyst is," Mason continued. "It's not a correction of what happened. It's a business necessity. And I understand that I'm not sitting here telling you you're wrong to make a business decision. I'm telling you that taking that offer would mean pretending the past 3 years happened differently than they did, and I'm not able to do that." He paused. "I'm also not able to do it because I'm trying to teach 3 children what it looks like to know what you're worth. And I can't teach them that while staying somewhere that only offered to acknowledge my value when a client forced the question." Ashby said very quietly, "How old are your children?" Mason looked at him. The question was unexpected. 14, 9, and 7. Ashby nodded once. He leaned back in his chair. Something in his bearing had shifted, not dramatically, but definitively, the way a balance tips when one more weight gets added to a scale. "Mr. Wickham," Ashby said, in a tone that had nothing performative in it, "I think we need to talk." He looked at Mason. "Not today, but I'd appreciate if you didn't make any final decisions this week." Mason looked at him. "I'll be in the building," he said. "I'm not going anywhere until I have somewhere to go." He stood up. He picked up his materials. He left the meeting room with the document still folded in his inside jacket pocket, unneeded, its existence enough. The elevator back to 21 was empty. He wrote it down watching the floor numbers change and thought about what had just come out of his mouth and whether he regretted any of it. He ran it back. He did not regret any of it. which was either integrity or stubbornness, and he decided years ago that in his particular case the distinction wasn't important enough to lose sleep over. Brandon was waiting at his desk, not subtly. He was standing next to it, not even pretending to be doing something else. "Well?" he said. I declined. Brandon stared at him. They offered you. I know what they offered me. And you said no." "Yes." Brandon put both hands on top of his head in the gesture of a man whose understanding of another person's decision-making has just fundamentally broken down. "Reed, why?" "Because the offer was real, but the reason for it was wrong." You can't." He stopped. Started again. "You have kids. You have a hot water heater situation. You mentioned it last week. I know. You turned down a real number because of a principle." "Yes." Brandon looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly, both hands came down from his head. Something in his expression settled into something that was quieter than his usual register, something that looked almost like it cost him. "I've been presenting your work for 6 weeks, he said. "Not my work specifically, but I was in the room when they did it. I let it happen." A pause. "I don't know what that says about me. It says you're 29 and working at a firm where that's how things work, and you didn't have enough reason yet to push back," Mason said. "That's not the same as being a bad person. It's being someone who hasn't been tested on it yet." Brandon was quiet. "What are you going to do?" "Work," Mason said. Same as always. He sat down and opened his laptop and did exactly that. The rest of the day moved slowly in the way of a day that is waiting on something. At 4:30, Renata called his desk, an unusual occurrence, and asked if he could come up to the 24th floor. Not Wickham's office, the East Conference Room. He went. Gerald Ashby was there alone. No Wickham, no Walsh, no Holt. Just Ashby in a chair at the far end of the conference table with a legal pad in front of him and a pen he wasn't using. Mason sat down. "I've been at this firm for 37 years, Ashby said, without preamble. "I founded it with 2 other men in a building in Coral Gables with a window unit that didn't work and a client list that fit on a single page." He looked at his legal pad. "I've seen a lot of the thing you described today. Good work going invisible. Institutions optimizing for who gets credit rather than what gets done." He paused. "I've participated in it at various points in ways I'm not particularly proud of." Mason waited. "I pulled the records this morning," Ashby said. "Your contribution records, the project logs, the attribution history on the major analyses from the past 3 years. My assistant spent the morning cross-referencing them." He looked up. "It's worse than I thought." Mason said nothing because there was nothing to say. It was exactly as bad as he documented in the folded paper in his jacket pocket, and exactly as bad as anyone paying attention would have found. "I want to make you an offer," Ashby said. "Different from what Wickham offered. Not a role on the Hartwell team, not a compensation adjustment. I want to fund a new division, independent risk advisory, operating as a separate entity within the firm, but with its own structure, its own client relationships, its own brand, led by you." He picked up the pen, looked at it, put it down. "It's not something I can promise will work. It's a genuine risk. You'd be building something, not stepping into something that already exists." Mason sat very still. "Why?" "Because the Hartwell thing made visible something I should have been paying attention to 3 years ago. And because—" Ashby stopped. Something in his face did the thing that people's faces do when they're being honest about something that costs them dignity. "Because I've been coasting on the assumption that good work finds its level eventually. Your situation is evidence that it doesn't, not automatically, not without someone deciding to make it find its level." "What's the timeline on this?" Mason said. "I want to move in 30 days, structure it before the Hartwell partnership is finalized, so you're entering those discussions from a position of your own rather than as an employee seeking recognition." "What's the comp structure?" Ashby named terms. They were not the same number as Wickham's offer. They were larger, structured differently. Base plus equity in the new division, which was either worth something real in 2 years or it was worth nothing, and the difference between those outcomes would be Mason's work. He thought about what Evelyn had said. "Make this decision like I don't exist." He thought about this decision. about the independent variable of it, just him and 3 kids and the work, and the question of whether he trusted himself to build something rather than maintain something. He thought about 6 weeks of 6:15 arrivals in the early dark and a model built in those hours that was currently the centerpiece of the biggest partnership discussion his firm had attempted in 5 years. "I need to talk to someone," he said. "Tonight." "Of course. I'll have an answer by tomorrow morning." Ashby nodded. He stood, which was Mason's cue to stand too. They shook hands across the table. Not performative, not the handshake of a deal already done, just 2 people making a physical acknowledgement that something real had been said. "Read," Ashby said as Mason moved toward the door. "The document in your jacket pocket. Whatever it is, keep it. You shouldn't need it, but keep it." Mason looked at him. He hadn't mentioned the document. "How?" 37 years, Ashby said simply. Mason rode the elevator back down. He drove home on automatic, barely registering the traffic, his mind running the variables at a pace that was faster and cleaner than usual, which happened sometimes when a decision was actually simple once the noise cleared away from it. He picked up Sophie from the afternoon program. She had a drawing she'd made of a horse and a bird sitting in a tree, which she explained was a story about 2 friends who were different but decided to be friends anyway. He told her it was great. She agreed. He got home, made dinner, existed in the rhythm of it. The table set, the food made, the homework checked. Caleb had a quiz returned that was 91% and was displaying the particular teenage restraint of someone who was pleased but had decided that enthusiasm was not the correct affect. Lily wanted to know if Margaret and Gerald could have a 3rd friend named Francis. Mason said he'd think about it, which by now they both understood to mean probably eventually. After the kids were in bed, he sat at his desk and opened his laptop. "Something happened today," he typed. Her response came quickly. "Tell me." He told her. The meeting with Wickham, the refusal, Ashby, the legal pad, the division proposal, the equity structure, the 30-day timeline. He told her all of it straight, without framing, the way he'd always told her things. The pause on her end was long. Not the kind of long that was deliberate, but the kind that meant she was actually thinking. "Mason," she wrote finally, "what do you want to do?" Not what should you do, what do you want? He thought about it honestly, the way he'd thought about everything this week, with the noise cleared away, just the actual variables. What he wanted. Not what made sense in theory, not what was safe, not what preserved what he already had. What he actually wanted. "I want to build something," he wrote. "I've been maintaining things for 3 years, maintaining someone else's firm, maintaining a life that's functional, but I want to build something that's mine." "Then do that," she said. Immediately. No hesitation. "The equity structure is a real risk." "I know." "If the division doesn't perform," "I know." A pause. "Mason, you built a model in your spare hours before 6 in the morning that is currently driving a $100 million partnership negotiation. What makes you think you can't build a division?" He looked at the screen. "Nothing," he admitted. "Then stop asking me for permission you don't need." He almost laughed. He sat in the dark room and almost laughed, which was an unusual thing to feel at 10:45 on a Tuesday night with a plumber's note on the counter and 3 kids asleep in the next rooms. "There's something else," he typed. "Okay, if I take this, the division, the new structure, and the Hartwell partnership comes together with me in it, we'd be working together, professionally, on the same deal." A pause. "Yes." "That changes things." "It complicates things," she corrected. "It doesn't change the underlying thing. You'd have to recuse yourself from some decisions. There'd be—" "I know the professional implications," she said. "I've been thinking about them for 2 weeks. I have a legal team that has seen more complex situations than 2 people who talked online for 8 months and then met at a party." A pause. "It's manageable. It's not easy, but it's manageable. The question is whether the underlying thing is worth managing it for." He looked at that sentence for a moment. "I think it is," he wrote. "For me, I think it is." "Me too," she said. Simple, direct, the way she said things when she wasn't hedging, when she was just telling the truth. He sat with that for a while. The city outside his window, the sound machine from Lily's room, The refrigerator, the plumber's note, the drawing Sophie had made of two different animals deciding to be friends. "I'm going to call Ashby in the morning," he typed. "Tell him yes." "Good. After that, I think we should meet. In person. Not in a conference room and not at a gala." A pause, and then, "Yes, I'd like that. There's a place on the bay, nothing special. Good coffee, and they leave you alone." "That sounds exactly right," she said. He closed the laptop. He did not sit in the dark for very long this time. He was tired, the real kind, the kind that meant the adrenaline of the day had finally metabolized. He went to bed and lay there for a few minutes and thought about the document in his jacket pocket, still folded, still undeployed. He'd carried it into that room as a kind of armor. He'd come out without needing to use it. He thought about Ashby, 37 years. He thought about the kind of man who builds a firm over 37 years and still has the capacity, in the corner office of his own 24th floor, to look at a wrong thing and call it wrong. It wasn't nothing. It didn't fix the 3 years. It didn't return what had been taken or rename what had been misattributed. But it was a man choosing to do a late right thing over a convenient wrong one. And Mason, who believed in being fair in his assessments even when it complicated his resentments, noted it. He would call Ashby at 8 in the morning. He would go to the Bayside coffee place on a day when they could both manage it and sit across from Evelyn Hart, from Nova, in a context that was neither professional nor digital, just two people in a public place, and he would figure out what that was like, and whether it held up in daylight, and whether the whole complicated human mess of what had been building since a rooftop in October had roots that could hold weight, or whether it was something else entirely. He didn't know. He was honest enough to not know, but he was going to find out. The alarm was set for 5:15. He'd be up before it. He was always up before it. He closed his eyes. The sound machine from Lily's room. The city outside doing what cities do. 3 kids in 3 rooms, existing, breathing, needing him tomorrow morning and the morning after that, and all the mornings after that, which was the most grounding thought he had access to on any given night, and which he let himself feel fully before the sleep came. Sophie's drawing was on the kitchen table, a horse and a bird in a tree. 2 different animals deciding to be friends anyway. He told her it was great. It was. He called Ashby at 8:03 in the morning. He'd been up since 5, made coffee, sat at the kitchen window watching the parking lot go from dark to gray to the flat yellow of a Miami morning that hadn't decided yet what kind of day it wanted to be. Caleb had come out at 7:15 in the semi-conscious state he operated in before school, found the cereal, eaten it standing at the counter, and departed without any formal acknowledgement of Mason's presence, which was normal and which Mason had stopped taking personally around the time Caleb turned 13. Sophie had appeared at 7:30, demanding to know where Gerald and Margaret were, located them on the shelf where she'd left them the night before, informed them of the day's schedule, and returned to getting dressed. Lily had eaten breakfast quietly, looking out the window, doing the thinking thing. "Did you decide something?" Lily asked. He looked at her. 9 years old, still in her school shirt, a piece of toast in her hand. "What do you mean?" "You have the face," she said. "The other one, not the one Caleb talks about, the different one, where you've decided something and you're waiting to do it." He looked at his daughter for a moment, the specific strange experience of being read accurately by someone who had known him her whole life but only 9 years of it. "Yeah," he said, "I decided something." "Good decision or bad one?" "I think good." She considered this, took a bite of toast, looked back out the window. "Okay," she said, as if that settled it. He drove them to school. He sat in the parking lot for 3 minutes, then he called Ashby. The conversation was brief. Ashby had been expecting the call. He said so without making it a performance, just stated it as information. Mason said yes to the division, yes to the equity structure, and told Ashby he wanted the attribution on the existing analyses corrected in the Hartwell materials before the next meeting. Not as a condition, as a fact that needed to be true before he could do the work going forward with any integrity. Ashby said he understood. Mason drove to the office. He arrived at 8:50, which was the latest he'd arrived in 3 years, and the floor noticed it the way floors notice small disruptions in established patterns. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and began writing the framework for what the new division would look like. Not a proposal, not a pitch to anyone internal, just the actual structural thinking, the way he built everything, from the ground up, with the assumptions stated clearly and the risks acknowledged. He worked until noon without interruption. Then Brandon appeared, which was as reliable as the tides. "Word travels," Brandon said. He pulled up the empty chair from the adjacent desk and sat in it, which he almost never did. It was a gesture of something, not intimacy exactly, but a deliberate choice to be present rather than hovering. "Ashby called a partner meeting this morning. You're getting a division." "Yes." "Named, Reed Advisory, within the Blackridge structure, but independently branded." Brandon was quiet for a second. He had a coffee cup that he was turning in his hands in the way of someone who needed something to do with his body while his brain worked. "What happened to the lower number Wickham offered?" "Different offer." "Better?" "More uncertain. Equity-based." Brandon nodded slowly. He understood equity. He'd grown up around equity. He knew the difference between a guaranteed number and a number that required you to build something real first. "You took the riskier one," he said. "Yes." Because it's mine," Mason said. Just that. Brandon sat with it. The coffee cup rotated in his hands. Outside the window, Miami was doing the midday thing, where the light went flat and white, and the bay looked like hammered metal. "I want to work with you," Brandon said, "on the division, if you'd have me." Mason looked at him. The 29-year-old who had mocked him about arriving without a date to a rooftop gala 6 weeks ago, who had watched Mason's work get attributed elsewhere and hadn't pushed back, and who had known it and had been carrying that knowledge with the particular discomfort of someone who was not entirely comfortable with what it said about them. Not a bad person. A person who hadn't been tested yet, and had now been tested and was trying to decide what kind of person he wanted to be on the other side of the test. "Not right away," Mason said. "The division needs to be established on its own first, but talk to me in 3 months. If you've done the work I think you're capable of doing, and if you've done it honestly, then yes." Brandon nodded. He seemed to understand that this was a real answer and not a polite deflection. 3 months, he said. He stood up, put the chair back. Then, with the slightly awkward directness of someone practicing a kind of honesty they're not yet comfortable with, "You deserve better here. For 3 years. I want you to know that I know that." Mason looked at him. "I know you know," he said. Brandon went back to his desk. Mason worked through the afternoon. Around 3, Priya stopped by and asked if the rumors were true. He confirmed them. She looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone whose response to good news for people they respect is complicated by the knowledge that the good news came from an institutional wrong being corrected late. She said she was glad. He believed her. She went back to her desk, and he went back to his framework, and the afternoon moved toward evening with the particular quality of a day that had done what it needed to do. He left at 5:30. Not 6:15, not the early departure of someone managing optics. Just a man who had made his calls and built his framework and whose kids needed dinner. He drove home with the radio on for the first time in weeks, which he didn't consciously notice until he was 3 blocks from the apartment and realized he'd been listening to something without registering it as noise to manage. He made dinner. He did not think about divisions or equity structures or Hartwell Global. He thought about whether the pasta was cooked enough. It was, barely, and about Caleb's history exam that was Thursday, and whether they needed to go over it again, and about Gerald and Margaret's potential new companion, Francis, whose existence Lily was advocating for with increasing strategic sophistication. He thought about cold showers, which were a next-week problem now rather than an ongoing one, because the hot water heater replacement was scheduled for Saturday, and the plumber's note was coming off the counter. After dinner, after the kids were settled with homework and reading and whatever Caleb was doing on his phone that he put down quickly when Mason walked by, just normally, the ordinary friction and warmth of 3 kids in a small apartment, Mason texted Evelyn. Not through the forum. Her actual number, which she'd sent him after the conference room meeting in a message that had said simply, "For when you're ready to use it." He'd been ready for 2 weeks. He'd waited because he wanted the decision with Ashby made first, wanted to walk into whatever came next between them as himself rather than as someone still in the middle of something. He texted, "Division is happening. Called Ashby this morning. I'm in." The response came in 4 minutes. "I know. Ashby's legal team sent mine a preliminary framework an hour ago." He smiled at his phone. You could have led with that. I wanted to hear it from you. He stood in the kitchen looking at those words and felt something loosen in his chest that had been held tight for longer than he'd been keeping track. Not the work thing, not the Blackridge thing, something underneath all of that. The particular tension of a person who has been managing so much for so long that they've stopped distinguishing between the things that are genuinely heavy and the things that are heavy because they've never been put down. The coffee place, he typed. Saturday morning, 9 o'clock. Kids have a thing at 10, so I have to be back, but 9 o'clock, she confirmed. I'll find it. It's not hard to find. There's a pelican that sits on the dock most mornings. Not affiliated with the establishment, he just likes it there. A pause, and then, I'll look for the pelican. He put his phone in his pocket. Sophie was calling from the living room with a question about spelling. He went to help her. Saturday morning arrived with the particular quality of Miami Saturdays in late autumn. Not cold, never cold, but with a quality of air that was different from the summer press of heat, something lighter and more honest about itself. Mason was up at 6. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked at Sophie's drawing, which had been there all week, the horse and the bird in the tree. He'd been meaning to hang it on the refrigerator and kept not doing it for no particular reason. And this morning he got up and found a magnet and put it up, slightly off-center, next to a school photo of Lily from last year that he'd been meaning to replace with the new one. The kids woke up in sequence. Sophie first, then Lily, then Caleb at 8:15 with the specific hair situation of someone who had slept in the exact same position for 9 hours. Mason made eggs. They ate. He told them he had something in the morning and Mrs. Delgado would be down the hall, and that their program started at 10 and they needed to be ready by 9:45. Caleb said he was always ready. Lily pointed out that last week Caleb had been looking for his left shoe at 9:43. Caleb said that was an anomaly. Sophie ate her eggs and did not weigh in on the shoe discourse. Mason showered, hot water, the first since Tuesday. The new heater installed yesterday afternoon by the same plumber whose note had been on the counter, and dressed and stood at the mirror in the bathroom and did not do the thing where he talked himself out of going or convinced himself that the timing was wrong or that he needed to be more prepared. He'd done enough of that in the previous weeks to have exhausted the exercise. He drove to the bay. The coffee place was called something forgettable, coastal something, or bayside something, and had been there long enough that the sign had faded in a way that meant it was either a fixture or soon to be gone. 6 tables outside on a dock that extended 12 feet over the water. A counter inside where a man in his 50s took orders without particular enthusiasm, but also without hostility. Coffee that was good and honest. The kind of place that had survived because the thing it did without pretending to be anything else. The pelican was there. It was sitting on a dock post 30 feet out, watching the water with the focused indifference of a bird that had been doing this longer than any of the humans around it. Mason got coffee and sat at the table at the end of the dock. 8:50. He watched the water. The bay was flat and silver this morning, the kind of flat that happened when the wind hadn't decided yet. A boat moved in the distance. Someone jogged along the path that ran behind the coffee place. The pelican didn't move. He heard her before he saw her. The specific sound of footsteps on a wooden dock, unhurried. He looked up. Evelyn Hart in jeans and a dark jacket, hair down, no briefcase, no team. Just her. She was looking at the pelican. You weren't wrong, she said. About the pelican. He's reliable. She sat down across from him. Up close, in daylight, without a gala or a conference room between them, she looked like someone who slept less than she should and moved through the world faster than was comfortable for most people, and had made a series of choices that had gotten her to 30 years old with $11 billion and no one in the passenger seat. She looked like a person, not a profile, not a CEO, not Nova translated into physical form. A person who had bags under her eyes and who was holding her coffee cup with both hands, the way people do when they need something to hold. Hi, she said. Hi. They sat for a moment with the water and the pelican and the city going about its Saturday business behind them. I've been thinking about what to say for 3 days, she said. I had several versions. They all sounded like a TED Talk, so I scrapped them. Probably good. I landed on just being here and seeing what happens. That's what I was going to do too. She looked at him. The morning light on the water was doing the thing it did. the silver going to gold in patches where the angle was right. She looked tired and clear-eyed and exactly like herself. "How are you feeling about the division?" "Scared," he said. He didn't soften it. "It's real work to build something. I've been executing on other people's structures for 3 years and I'm good at it, but building is different. You know things are going to go wrong that you can't predict and you can't protect against in advance. It's just, you do it and you deal with what comes." "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what it is. You've done it. Several times. It doesn't stop being that." She wrapped both hands tighter around her cup. "The first time I did it, I was 24 and I had no money, and I had an idea, and I had a lot of confidence that I look back on now and think was about 60% bravado and 40% genuine." A pause. "I'm glad I didn't know the ratio at the time. What happened when things went wrong?" "Several things went wrong. In the first year, 3 things went wrong that I had specifically told my investors wouldn't go wrong." She said it flatly, not performing the memory. "I called each of them and told them what happened and what I was doing about it. I lost one of them. The other 2 stayed. One of them said afterward that the reason he stayed was because I called him before I had a solution instead of after. He said most people he'd worked with waited until they had something to show." "But to shut." She paused. "I didn't have anything to show. I just called because it was the honest thing to do." Mason looked at her. "That's something you've had your whole life, isn't it? That reflex." "What reflex?" "Toward honesty, even when it costs you something." She thought about it. "I think so. I don't always like it. It would be easier sometimes to not." She looked at the water. "I think it came from watching my father run the firm before I took it over. He was excellent at the technical work and genuinely not very good at the people part. Not cruel, just he operated on the assumption that performance spoke for itself and that relationships were secondary to results. He spent 20 years building something excellent and then spent 5 years watching excellent people leave it because nobody was paying attention to them." A pause. "I decided when I was 22 that I wasn't going to do that." "And then you spent 8 months talking to someone online without telling him who you were." She winced. It was small and genuine. "Yes, I'm aware of the irony. I'm not trying to reopen it." "I know." She looked at him directly. "I'm aware that it was a contradiction. I'm aware that my reason, wanting to be known without being known as who I am, was a real reason and also a self-serving one. Both things are true." A pause. "I've thought about it a lot." "What did you decide?" "That I did something that was imperfect for reasons that were real, and that the best I can do going forward is be straight with you. Not about everything simultaneously, because that's not how people work, but straight. No managed reveal. No information asymmetry I'm controlling for my own comfort." She held his eyes. "I know that's a statement and not a track record. You don't have to take it as a guarantee." "I don't need a guarantee," Mason said. "I need you to mean it." "I mean it." He believed her, not blindly. He was not a person who believed things blindly. Hadn't been since long before Blackridge or the kids or any of the things that had taught him the specific cost of misplaced trust. He believed her the way he believed the currency mismatch analysis would hold under examination, because he'd checked the work from multiple angles and it held up every time. They sat for a while without filling it. The bay moved slightly, the flat silver of it giving way to something more textured as a small wind came through. The Pelican shifted on its post, considered something in the middle distance, decided against it. "Tell me about them," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "Your kids. You've mentioned them in pieces. Caleb, the 2 girls. Tell me about them like they're people, not like you're giving me a summary." He looked at the water. He thought about where to start with that. How do you describe the people you love most to someone who hasn't met them? Someone you want to see them accurately. Not perform them, see them. Caleb is 14 and he's the kind of smart that's going to be genuinely difficult for him for a few years, Mason said. Because he can see through things faster than he can figure out what to do with what he sees. He argued last week that historical dates shouldn't count on exams if you understand the context. He's not wrong as a philosophical position. He's going to be wrong about it until he learns that some systems require you to demonstrate the basics before they let you question the structure. He paused. He's also the first person who noticed when something was wrong with me this fall. He didn't say much about it. He just noticed. And the girls? Lily is 9, and she's been running a quiet campaign for 3 months to acquire a third stuffed rabbit named Francis. She's never asked directly. She's just been building a case through incrementally increasing references to how Gerald and Margaret seem like they could use more social connection. I respect the strategy. He almost smiled. She's going to be fine. She already knows how to want something and work toward it without burning the whole room down. That's going to carry her. And Sophie. He was quiet for a second. Sophie is 7, and she is very confident that the world should make sense and is genuinely baffled when it doesn't. She made a drawing this week of a horse and a bird who became friends even though they were different. She explained the narrative arc to me in detail. He looked at the water. She's the one who most reminds me that things can be simpler than I make them. Evelyn was quiet. She had been listening the way she listened, fully, without preparing her response while he spoke, which was a thing he'd noticed about her online and which held in person the same way. "You love them the way people are supposed to love things," she said. "Not as a performance. You just do." "They're mine," he said. "Simple. Most people make that feel more complicated than it is." "I know." He looked at her. "You should meet them. Not today, not soon necessarily, but eventually. When it makes sense. I'm not going to keep the 2 parts of my life separated indefinitely." She held his gaze. "I'd like that. They'll have opinions. I would expect nothing less from the children of a man who went to a meeting with a folded document in his jacket pocket and still didn't use it." He stopped. "How do you know about the document?" "Ashby told me." Something in her expression was close to amusement, close to something else. "He said you came in armed and left without firing. He said it told him more than the conversation did." Mason looked out at the water. The sun had moved enough that the angle was different now, the silver fully gone to gold where the light hit directly. He thought about 37 years and a founding partner who had learned something late, but had learned it. He thought about the document still sitting folded in his jacket pocket upstairs in the apartment, which he'd decided to keep not as a weapon, but as a reminder of what he'd built, what he'd protected, what he'd refused to let go of even when the room made it expensive. "I didn't need it," he said. "The truth was already visible. You'd already been in the room." "Yes," she said. "I had." They sat with that for a moment. "I need to ask you something," Mason said, "and I need you to answer it honestly even if the answer is complicated." "Always." "What does this look like, the 2 of us? Practically?" "My life is... I've told you what my life is. It's 3 kids and a 615 alarm and a hot water heater that just got replaced and a division I'm about to try to build from scratch. I don't have a life with a lot of..." He paused, looking for the word. "Room in it. And your life is..." "Different," she said. "I know." She set her coffee down. "I've been running an organization since I was 27. I travel 4 days out of 10 on average. I have a board that requires management and clients that require presence and a personal life that has consistently finished 3rd behind the other 2. She looked at him. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know that's a problem. I'm not going to tell you it'll be easy or that I've figured out how to make it work because I haven't done this before with stakes I actually cared about." A pause. "What I can tell you is that I'm not interested in easy. I've had easy, and it turns out easy is just another word for low stakes. And I've been living at low personal stakes for a long time, and I'm tired of it." "You're 30 years old." "I know how old I am." She said it without heat. "I'm telling you that I've been building things since I was 22, and I know what it feels like when something is worth building and when it isn't, and I know which one this is." Mason sat with that. The coffee in his hand had gone from hot to warm. The Pelican had relocated to a closer post, apparently unmoved by the conversation happening 9 feet away. The Saturday morning was continuing without particular regard for the 2 people on the dock. "I'm going to get things wrong," he said. "I work too much. I spend a lot of mental energy on things that have already been decided and can't be changed. I keep things inside longer than is probably useful. I have 3 kids who will, at various points, have opinions about anyone I bring into proximity to our life, and those opinions will matter to me more than most things. I know. I'm not a simple person to be..." "Mason," she stopped him, not unkindly. "I know. I've known for 8 months. I'm not here by accident." He looked at her. Evelyn Hart on a wooden dock with morning light on the water and her coffee going cold and her hair doing the thing it did when the bay wind moved through it. Not curated, not managed, just there. The same person who had been Nova at 3 in the morning in arguments about institutional loyalty and whether honesty was a luxury. The same person who had walked across a rooftop and said don't to a man who had been about to disappear. Okay, he said. Okay, okay. He looked at her. We figure it out, both of us. We don't have to have it figured out right now. Something in her face settled, the way things settle when they've been held in tension and are allowed to release. Not relief exactly. She wasn't the type for unguarded relief. He knew that about her now. But something in that direction. Something that said, yes, that. There's one more thing, she said. Okay, the Hartwell partnership. When it finalizes, and I believe it will, the framework is sound. You'll be the primary contact on the Blackridge side. We'll be working together professionally. She looked at him steadily. I'm not going to pretend that's not complicated. My board will have views. Your situation at Blackridge will be layered. People will say things. Let them, Mason said. She looked at him, just like that. What would you like me to say instead? That I'm going to let what other people say about something real determine whether I pursue it? He looked at the water. I spent 3 years doing work that was real and having people say it wasn't mine. I'm not going to apply that same logic in the other direction. She was quiet for a moment, then, that might be the most direct thing you've ever said to me. You said no more information asymmetry. I did. That's me being straight with you. She held his gaze. The morning light had shifted again. The bay doing what the bay does when the wind finally commits. The surface going from flat to moving, from silver to a dozen different things at once. Okay, she said. Me too. They sat for another 20 minutes. They talked about the division, the framework Mason had been building, the gaps he'd identified, the places where he was still working out the structure. She had questions that were good questions, the kind that came from someone who had built things and knew which load-bearing walls you had to get right in the first draft. He answered them honestly, including the places where he didn't know yet, and she listened to the not knowing without rushing past it to the part where it resolved. At 8:56, his phone buzzed. Caleb. Sophie can't find Margaret. He showed Evelyn the message. She read it. Margaret is the newer rabbit. She'll be on the shelf. Sophie looked in her bed and didn't find her there and has declared a crisis. He was already typing back. She's on the shelf, left side. Check behind Gerald. A pause. Then Caleb. Found her. Crisis averted. Also, Sophie wants to know if you're bringing anyone home. He stared at that for a second. Evelyn had read it too. He'd been holding the phone in a way that wasn't private, hadn't been thinking about privacy, which was itself something. He watched her read it and watched her face do the thing that faces do when they receive information and decide what to do with it. What are you going to tell him? She said. He looked at her. I'm going to tell him not today. He typed it, put the phone in his pocket. But I'm going to tell him other things eventually when it's the right time to tell them. And when is the right time? When I know it's real enough to bring into their lives. When I'm sure, not certain, I'm never certain, but sure enough that I'm not bringing something temporary into something permanent. He looked at her. I'm not there yet, but I'm not as far from it as I was 6 weeks ago. She nodded. The honesty of it landed between them without complication. That's fair, she said. Is it enough for you, right now? She held his gaze for a long moment. Yes, she said. Right now, yes. He stood. She stood. The Pelican, apparently having decided the dock was offering diminishing returns this morning, spread its wings and lifted off in the particular unhurried way of birds that have been doing something for long enough that they don't feel the need to make a production of it. It cleared the water by 12 feet and angled south toward wherever pelicans went when they were done watching. They walked back along the dock together. At the land end where the dock met the path, they stopped. People moved past on the jogging path. The coffee place was doing more business now, the Saturday morning crowd filling up the outdoor tables. I'll see you at the Hartwell preliminary in 2 weeks, she said. Professional context. Professional context, he agreed. And before that, if you want to... Yes, he said. He didn't make her finish the sentence. She looked at him. Something in her expression was careful and warm at the same time, which was very her, which he'd come to understand was not a contradiction, but was just her particular combination. The person who had built $11 billion and who had been afraid to tell him her name. Both of those things fully true at once. "Take care of your kids," she said. "Always," he said. She walked to her car. He walked to his. He drove home with the radio on and the windows down and the Miami morning doing what it did. All light and motion and the particular forward momentum of a city that didn't particularly care what you were carrying but was going to keep moving regardless. He got home at 9:20. Sophie met him at the door with Margaret in one hand and Gerald in the other, and the news that she had found Margaret on the shelf behind Gerald exactly where she was supposed to be. He said that was good news. She agreed and went back to whatever she'd been doing. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the drawing on the refrigerator, slightly off-center, the horse and the bird in the tree. He looked at the counter where the bills were. Fewer of them now. The hot water heater note was gone, replaced by the plumber's receipt, which he'd pay next week and which was already accounted for in the math that had gotten easier now that the math was different. He thought about something his sister had said to him 2 years ago when she'd called on a Sunday and asked how he was doing, and he'd said fine in the way that meant not fine but manageable. And she'd said, "Mason, you're allowed to want things for yourself too. It's not just the kids. It's allowed to be you too." He told her he was fine. He'd meant it in the sense that he was keeping everything upright and nothing was falling and the kids were okay. He hadn't meant it in the sense of being good. He'd never claimed that. He understood now that those were different things, that the keeping upright was necessary and real and something he would never stop doing because those 3 people in his apartment needed it, and he would burn himself down to the waterline before he let them lack for it. But that it wasn't the whole story. That there was a version of his life where he was also, in the spaces between, allowed to want something for himself, allowed to be seen by someone who chose to see him, allowed to be not just the man who showed up before everyone else and stayed after everyone left and wrote documents in the early dark that ended up under other people's names, allowed to be, finally, building something with his own name on it. He'd refused Wickham's offer and walked out of the lower chair and said the thing out loud in front of Ashby and Walsh and 3 years of silence, and the world had not ended. The world had, in fact, done something more interesting than end. It had rearranged. Not cleanly, not without cost, not into anything that looked like the clean narrative of a man who did the right thing and was immediately rewarded for it. The hot water heater had still broken. The document had still needed to exist. 3 years of early mornings had still happened in ways that couldn't be retroactively fixed. But they had happened. They were part of him. The work he'd done in those early mornings was real and had mattered and was now the foundation of something he was building with his own name. And the woman he'd talked to honestly for 8 months because she couldn't see him had come to find him when she could. And his daughter had made a drawing about 2 different animals deciding to be friends. And his son had gotten a 91 on a quiz about a war that happened 160 years ago. And somewhere in the city, Evelyn Hart was probably already in her car on the way to something, the next thing, the way she always was. He had a 9:45 departure to meet. He had 3 kids who needed to be at their program by 10. He had a division to build starting Monday and a partnership meeting in 2 weeks, and a life that was not easy, had never been easy, was not going to become easy simply because some things had shifted, but was beginning, for the first time in a long time, to feel like it was fully his. He knocked on Caleb's door. 5 minutes, Caleb said from inside. 10 minutes, Mason said. Be ready. I'm always ready. You're rarely ready. Dad. Caleb. A pause. Then the sound of movement from inside the room, the particular sound of a 14-year-old deciding not to have the argument they were setting up to have. Mason went to check on the girls. Lily was ready. She had her bag, her shoes, and a look that said she had noticed something about the morning that she wasn't ready to ask about yet, but was filing away for future reference. He recognized this from long experience. She would ask eventually, at a moment he wouldn't predict, in the precise and sideways way she asked things. He would answer honestly, because that was the only model he knew how to offer her. Sophie was wearing one shoe and looking for the other with the focused intensity of someone who believed that if you looked at a problem hard enough, it would reveal itself. The missing shoe was under the coffee table. He pointed. She retrieved it with the triumph of someone vindicated. She sat on the couch and put it on with the laborious ceremony of a person for whom getting dressed was a production every single time. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," she said. "Shoe now on. Gerald and Margaret properly situated on the shelf. Let's go." They went. Mason Reed, 32 years old, single father of 3, division head of a thing that didn't exist yet but would. A man who had spent 3 years invisible in a building full of people and who had spent 8 months known by someone who hadn't been able to see him and who had decided to come find him anyway. Mason Reed walked out of his apartment into a Saturday morning in Miami that was warm and bright and moving in all directions at once, with a 9-year-old who was explaining to her older brother why Margaret was different from Gerald in ways that were subtle but important, and a 7-year-old who was already asking if they could get ice cream after, and a 14-year-old who had one earbud in and was pretending not to listen to any of it, but was listening to all of it. The city opened up around them. It had always been opening up around him. He'd been too tired to see it most days, too busy keeping everything upright to notice that the walls he'd been holding in place were also the walls that had been keeping the light out. He was still tired. That part didn't disappear. He would be up at 5:15 Monday morning to start building something with his own name on it, and the first 3 months would be hard in ways he couldn't fully predict, and there would be days when the arithmetic didn't work, and days when the kids needed things he was stretched thin to give, and days when the distance between his life and Evelyn's felt like more than geography. He knew all of that. He knew it, and he walked into the Saturday morning anyway. Sophie's hand in his left hand, Lily's in his right. Caleb 3 steps ahead with his one earbud in. The 4 of them moving together through a city that didn't notice and didn't need to. Because Mason Reed had spent 3 years waiting to be noticed by a room full of people who were looking at everything except him. He understood now that the room had never been the point. The point had been the work. The point had been the 3 people walking beside him and the one who had come across a rooftop to say don't go. The point had been staying honest even when honesty cost him, and finding out eventually that the cost had not been final. He was not at the end of something hard. He was at the beginning of something uncertain. But uncertainty and hard were things Mason Reed had learned to live inside of, had built a life inside of, had raised 3 children inside of. And if the past 6 weeks had taught him anything, it was that the man he'd been in all those quiet, invisible early mornings was worth more than anyone at Blackridge Capital had ever troubled themselves to see. One person had seen it. She'd seen it from 8 months and a screen away, and she'd come to a rooftop to make sure he knew. He squeezed Sophie's hand. She looked up at him. "Ice cream?" she asked. "After," he said. "Promise?" He looked down at her, 7 years old, one shoe that had been under the coffee table, fully convinced that the world should make sense and baffled when it didn't, already learning that sometimes it did anyway. "Promise," he said. And the city kept going, as cities do, indifferent and enormous, and lit up even in daylight by its own relentless aliveness, and Mason Reed walked into it with everything he had, which was not very much by some measures, and was everything by the ones that counted. It was enough. It had always been enough. He just needed long enough to finally believe it,